Hey guys, tonight we venture into the savage legend of Leman Russ, the Wolf King of Fenris, the fierce primarch who, against the Emperor's enemies and his own wild nature, became humanity's most loyal executioner. From his discovery among the ice wolves to his mysterious disappearance into the Eye of Terra, this is a story of loyalty, brotherhood, tragedy, and the burden of being the Emperor's final sanction. So, before we dive into the warp, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're interested in God of War lore, do visit my channel Spartan Slumber. I've added the link in the description below. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world as we explore the galaxy's darkest secrets. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Get into your blanket, and let's ease into tonight's journey through the stars together. In the frozen wastes of Fenris, where entire continents shift beneath oceans of ice, and the very air can freeze a man's lungs solid, a single child would rise to become the galaxy's most feared executioner. Not through cruelty or malice, but through an absolute, unwavering loyalty that would ultimately demand the most terrible of prices. This is the tale of Leman Russ, sixth son of the Emperor of Mankind, whose savage exterior concealed one of the most brilliant tactical minds ever created, and whose greatest victories would become his most haunting failures. Picture this moment, if you will. Somewhere in the trackless void beyond the Eye of Terra, a lone figure wrapped in wolf pelts strides through landscapes that would drive lesser minds to madness. His amber eyes burn with purpose, as ancient as the galaxy itself, seeking something that may not even exist. This is the Wolf King in his final hunt, pursuing a prize that could either redeem everything he has lost or damn him forever. But that tale lies at the end of our journey tonight. To understand how the proudest of the Emperor's sons came to walk alone through hell itself, we must journey back to the beginning, to a world where survival was earned with blood and honor was measured by the strength of one's pack. We must travel to Fenris, where a child fell from the stars and was raised not by men, but by wolves. The Wolf King's story begins not with triumph, but with abandonment. Cast into the void as an infant, when the Chaos Gods scattered the primarch pods across the galaxy, Leman Russ would endure trials that would forge him into something far more dangerous than even his gene father intended. For on Fenris, the weak do not simply fail, they die. And only those who embrace both the beast and the king within themselves can hope to survive what this death world demands. But even as we speak of his origins among the ice and snow, remember this: Leman Russ was never truly wild. Beneath the wolf pelts and barbaric facade lived a mind sharp enough to outmaneuver primarchs who considered themselves his intellectual superiors. He understood that sometimes, to serve the greater good, one must become the villain in someone else's story. And in the grim darkness of the far future, that understanding would make him perhaps the most tragic figure in all the Imperium's bloody history. What Leman Russ would discover 10,000 years after the fires of the Horus Heresy had died to embers was that loyalty is not always rewarded with honor. Sometimes the most faithful sons are asked to bear the heaviest burdens. Sometimes those who love their father most are forced to become his instruments of destruction. And sometimes the only way to truly serve is to walk away from everything you've ever known, into darkness so complete that even the gods fear to tread there. Tonight, we will trace every step of that journey, from the moment a child opened his eyes in a world of ice and death, to the day a broken king turned his back on the Imperium he had bled for and walked into legend. We will witness the forging of the Space Wolves, the burning of Prospero, the tragedy of the Horus Heresy, and finally, the great hunt that took Leman Russ beyond the edge of known space. This is more than just the story of one primarch. This is the chronicle of what happens when the perfect weapon develops a conscience, when the ideal soldier begins to question his orders, and when the most loyal son realizes that sometimes the only way to save what you love is to leave it behind. So settle in, my friends, as we begin our journey to the death world, where legends are born and heroes learn the true price of duty. For in the saga of Leman Russ, we will discover that even gods can be broken, even the mightiest warriors can weep, and even the most savage beasts can possess hearts capable of the deepest love and the most profound sacrifice. Long before the coming of the Wolf King, Fenris stood as one of the galaxy's most unforgiving death worlds, a planet so hostile that survival itself was considered a form of victory. This was not a world that bred weakness or entertained mercy. Every aspect of Fenrisian existence was designed by nature's cruel hand to forge either wolves or corpses, and the distinction between the two was often measured in heartbeats. The planet's eccentric orbital pattern created seasonal variations so extreme they defied comprehension. For years at a time, Fenris would swing close to its sun, transforming the ice-locked continents into boiling archipelagos, where steam rose in continent-spanning clouds. Then, as the world's elliptical path carried it to the outer reaches of the system, temperatures would plummet so rapidly that entire seas would freeze solid within days. The atmosphere itself would begin to crystallize and fall as snow, leaving only the hardiest organisms any hope of survival. But even these crushing environmental extremes paled beside the planet's geological instability. Fenris was a world in constant motion, its tectonic plates grinding against each other with such violence that entire mountain ranges would be born and destroyed within a single generation. The planet's crust was thin and fractured, allowing massive volcanic systems to reshape the surface with terrifying regularity. During the brief summers, the melting ice would trigger seismic events that could split continents and drain seas overnight. What made this chaos truly deadly was its unpredictability. A tribe might establish a settlement on solid ground, only to watch their homeland sink beneath boiling seas as the world's orbit carried it towards summer. Conversely, they might build boats to traverse the temporary oceans, only to find themselves stranded on dry land as winter returned and their highways of water became mountains of ice. This constant upheaval meant that no civilization could ever truly take root. Every structure was temporary, every alliance subject to the whims of planetary forces beyond human control. The native life that had evolved to survive these conditions was uniformly massive, aggressive, and perfectly adapted to the world's cycles of destruction and rebirth. During the summer months, colossal sea beasts called kraken would emerge from the depths to hunt in the shallow seas that covered most continents. These creatures, some large enough to swallow entire settlements, possessed intelligence enough to remember the patterns of human migration and position themselves accordingly. Their tentacles could crush stone, their beaks could shear through metal, and their alien minds held grudges that lasted for centuries. On land, the apex predators were the Fenrisian wolves, creatures that stood taller than horses and possessed intelligence that bordered on human cunning. Unlike their smaller cousins on other worlds, Fenrisian wolves had evolved to be perfect pack hunters, capable of coordinating complex strategies across vast distances. Their howls could carry for hundreds of kilometers through the thin air, allowing scattered packs to communicate and coordinate their hunts. More terrifyingly, they seemed to possess an instinctive understanding of human psychology, able to predict and counter tactical decisions with uncanny accuracy. The ice trolls that emerged during the deepest winters were perhaps the most feared of all Fenris's predators. Standing twice the height of a normal man, and possessing strength enough to tear apart stone fortifications, these creatures were nearly impossible to kill through conventional means. Their hide was thick enough to turn aside most primitive weapons. Their bones were harder than steel, and they possessed a primitive cunning that made them far more dangerous than simple beasts. Worse still, they seemed to take a malicious pleasure in tormenting their prey, often keeping captives alive for days while they slowly consumed them. Against this backdrop of environmental hostility and predatory wildlife, humanity had not merely survived, but had developed one of the galaxy's most distinctive warrior cultures. The human tribes of Fenris had long ago abandoned any pretense of permanent civilization, instead adopting a nomadic lifestyle that allowed them to follow the ever-changing patterns of their world's seasons. They lived in kinship groups ranging from a few dozen to several hundred individuals, each bound together by blood ties and mutual dependence that made betrayal not just dishonorable, but suicidal. These tribes were not barbaric savages, despite what outside observers might assume. They possessed sophisticated oral traditions that preserved thousands of years of accumulated wisdom, passing down through spoken sagas, everything from tactical knowledge to astronomical observations to complex genealogies that tracked bloodlines across centuries. Their shamanic traditions had developed into a complex system of beliefs that recognized the semi-sentient nature of Fenris itself, treating the planet as a living entity whose moods and desires could be interpreted by those with sufficient wisdom and experience. The tribal structure was built around the fundamental principle that had allowed humanity to survive on Fenris: the strength of the pack. Individual prowess was respected and celebrated, but never at the expense of group cohesion. Every member of a tribe had a role to play in the group's survival, from the mightiest warriors to the youngest children. Warriors earned status through brave deeds and wise counsel, but a warrior who put personal glory before the tribe's survival was considered worse than useless. Such individuals were either reformed through harsh discipline or exiled to face the world's dangers alone, which amounted to a death sentence. Leadership among the tribes was earned through a combination of martial prowess, tactical brilliance, and the ability to inspire loyalty in others. Kings and jarls did not rule through divine right or inherited privilege, but through constant demonstration of their worthiness to lead. A leader who made poor decisions or showed cowardice in the face of danger would quickly find his followers looking elsewhere for guidance. This system created a warrior aristocracy that was both meritocratic and utterly ruthless, where weakness was not just discouraged, but literally could not be tolerated in positions of authority. The concept of honor that developed among the Fenrisian tribes was more complex and nuanced than simple martial valor. Honor was understood to be the sum total of one's actions in service to the tribe and the ancestors. A truly honorable warrior was one who showed courage in battle. Yes, but also wisdom in counsel, generosity to the weak, loyalty to companions, and respect for the traditions that bound the tribe together. Death in battle was indeed considered the highest honor, but only if that death served some greater purpose. Dying uselessly was seen as wasteful and shameful, regardless of how bravely one fought. This harsh world had created a people who understood perhaps better than any other human culture in the galaxy that survival required both individual strength and absolute group loyalty. They had learned that in a universe filled with predators, the lone wolf was always doomed. Only by standing together, by combining their strengths and covering each other's weaknesses, could they hope to endure what Fenris demanded of them. These were the conditions, these were the people, and this was the death world that would shape the character of one of the Emperor's greatest sons. When Leman Russ's primarch pod finally crashed through Fenris's atmosphere, it was entering a realm where weakness meant death, where survival required both savage cunning and unwavering loyalty, and where the very concept of civilization had been refined down to its most essential elements. The child who would emerge from this crucible would be unlike any of his brothers, forged by a world that demanded nothing less than perfection from those who dared to call it home. The primarch pod that carried the infant Leman Russ struck the surface of Fenris during one of the planet's most brutal winter storms. The craft, damaged by whatever force had scattered the Emperor's sons across the galaxy, plowed through kilometers of ice and snow before finally coming to rest in a valley so remote that even the hardiest Fenrisian tribes avoided it during the deep cold. The impact created a crater that would remain visible for centuries, but in those first crucial hours, the only witnesses to this cosmic event were the creatures that called the frozen wasteland home. What emerged from that shattered pod was not the godlike being that would one day command legions, but a child whose survival depended entirely on forces beyond any human control. The infant primarch possessed the superhuman constitution that would eventually make him nearly indestructible, but even that enhanced physiology had limits. In the sub-zero temperatures that could freeze exposed flesh in minutes, even a primarch needed protection to survive his first night on Fenris. That protection came from an unexpected source. A pack of Fenrisian wolves, drawn by the strange energies radiating from the crash site, discovered the child among the wreckage. These were not the smaller, more familiar wolves found on other human worlds, but the apex predators of Fenris itself. Each member of the pack stood nearly as tall as a grown human, with intelligence that bordered on human cunning and pack bonds so strong that they would die before abandoning one of their own. The lead female of this pack, ancient by wolf standards, and bearing the scars of countless battles, approached the strange child with the caution of a creature that had learned to be suspicious of anything unusual. Yet something about the infant called to instincts deeper than mere predatory interest. Perhaps it was the child's lack of fear, or the way he reached toward her with obvious trust, or perhaps some deeper genetic recognition of kinship. Whatever the reason, instead of treating the foundling as prey, she accepted him as pack. For the next several years, Leman Russ learned to survive as a wolf among wolves. He developed the ability to track prey across vast distances using scent trails invisible to normal humans. He learned to read the subtle body language that allowed the pack to coordinate their hunts without sound. Most importantly, he absorbed the fundamental truth that would define his entire existence, that the strength of the individual meant nothing compared to the strength of the pack united. The child grew at an accelerated rate that defied natural law, reaching the size and strength of a grown human while still possessing the instincts and reflexes of a predator. His enhanced senses allowed him to perceive threats and opportunities that even the wolves missed. His developing tactical mind began to devise hunting strategies of unprecedented complexity, leading pack hunts that brought down prey that had previously been beyond their reach. But even as he thrived among his adoptive family, Leman Russ was changing in ways that set him apart from his wolf companions. His vocalization developed beyond simple growls and howls, experimenting with sounds and patterns that seemed to reach toward something more sophisticated. His use of tools progressed from simple stone and bone implements to increasingly complex constructions. Most tellingly, he began to show signs of the strategic thinking that would later make him one of the Imperium's greatest military minds. The turning point came during a hunt that would become legend among the Fenrisian tribes for generations to come. A massive ice troll had established territory in a valley that controlled access to one of the few reliable water sources in the region. This creature, standing nearly 4 meters tall and possessing strength enough to shatter boulders with its bare hands, had killed or driven off every pack that attempted to challenge it. The local ecosystem was slowly dying as smaller predators and prey animals alike were forced to seek water elsewhere. Leman Russ, now approaching the size and strength of an adult human despite his youth, convinced his pack to attempt what no other group had dared. Rather than the direct assault that had failed so many others, he devised a strategy that relied on patience, deception, and perfect coordination among pack members. The hunt took 3 days to execute, with wolves positioned at precise locations throughout the valley to drive the troll toward a carefully prepared killing ground. When the ice troll finally fell, brought down not by brute force, but by tactical brilliance that used the creature's own strength against it, the victory resonated far beyond a single pack's survival. The sound of the battle had carried across the frozen landscape, and the aftermath drew the attention of human scouts from several different tribes. For the first time since his arrival on Fenris, Leman Russ found himself observed by members of his own species. Among those scouts was a grizzled warrior named Then-Gur, king of the tribe known as the Russ. Unlike many of his peers, Then-Gur possessed the wisdom to recognize that the massive figure directing the wolf pack was something far more significant than a feral human who had somehow survived in the wilderness. The tactical sophistication of the hunt, the obvious leadership being displayed, and the sheer physical presence of the young man all spoke to possibilities that extended far beyond simple survival. Then Gyr approached the scene with the careful diplomacy of a leader who understood that he was witnessing something unprecedented. Rather than attempting to capture or threaten the wolf child, he offered respect and recognition. He presented gifts appropriate for a successful hunt leader, spoke words of praise for the tactical brilliance that had brought down such a formidable opponent, and most importantly, extended an invitation rather than making demands. The first meeting between Leman Russ and human civilization was not a dramatic confrontation or a moment of instant transformation. Instead, it was a gradual process of mutual evaluation and growing trust. Then Ger would visit the site regularly, always bringing gifts and always treating the young man as an equal rather than a curiosity. Slowly, carefully, he began to introduce concepts of human speech, human customs, and human society. Leman Russ proved to be an extraordinarily quick learner when it came to human language and culture. His enhanced intellect, previously focused entirely on survival and hunting, began to explore concepts of leadership, honor, and social organization with the same intensity he had once applied to tracking prey. Yet he never abandoned the lessons learned among the wolves. The pack mentality, the instinctive understanding of group dynamics, the absolute loyalty to those who had earned trust, all of these concepts translated directly into his growing comprehension of human tribal structure. The process of integration took the better part of 2 years, during which Leman demonstrated abilities that far exceeded even the enhanced expectations that Dengir had developed. His physical strength allowed him to accomplish feats that would have challenged entire groups of ordinary warriors. His tactical mind revolutionized the tribe's approach to hunting and warfare. His natural charisma began to inspire a loyalty that went beyond mere respect for strength. When then Ger formally adopted Leman Russ as his heir and war leader, the ceremony represented more than simple political calculation. The aging king had recognized in this strange foundling the qualities necessary to not just lead a single tribe, but to unite the scattered clans of Fenris under a single banner. What then Ger could not have anticipated was that he was placing his confidence in one of the Emperor's own sons, a being created specifically to lead humanity toward a greater destiny. The young man who took the name Leman of the Russ carried within him the genetic legacy of the master of mankind, enhanced far beyond normal human capabilities and destined for achievements that would echo across the galaxy. But he also carried the lessons learned during his years among the wolves, understanding that true strength came not from individual prowess, but from the absolute trust and coordination of the pack. This dual nature, part civilized king and part primal predator, would define every aspect of his future career as both tribal leader and primarch of the 6th Legion. As news of Dengir's remarkable adopted son spread among the scattered tribes of Fenris, none could have imagined that they were witnessing the emergence of a figure who would one day command the loyalty of thousands of space marines, burn entire worlds in the Emperor's name, and ultimately walk alone into the eye of Terra in pursuit of redemption. The wolf child who had learned to hunt among the packs was about to discover that some hunts require not fangs and claws, but crowns and armies. The transformation of Leman Russ from tribal foundling to legendary war leader began with a series of challenges that would have broken lesser men before they truly began. Then Ger's adoption of the wolf child had not been universally welcomed among the Russ tribe, and several of the king's own blood relatives viewed this decision as both politically dangerous and personally insulting. The ancient traditions of Fenris demanded that leadership be proven through combat, and many warriors believed that the time had come to test whether this mysterious newcomer truly deserved the position he had been granted. The first formal challenge came from Jorik the Red-Handed, then Ger's nephew, and previously considered the most likely heir to tribal leadership. Jorik was a formidable warrior in his own right, having led successful raids against 3 rival tribes and personally killed 2 ice trolls in single combat. His challenge was issued publicly during the midwinter feast, before witnesses from several allied clans who had gathered to discuss territorial agreements and trade arrangements. Rather than the quick, decisive victory that many expected, the duel between Leman and Jorik became a masterclass in tactical adaptation and psychological warfare that observers would discuss for generations. Jorik opened with the aggressive assault tactics that had served him well against human opponents, relying on superior reach and battlefield experience to overwhelm his younger challenger. For the first several minutes, it appeared that the veteran warrior's approach might succeed. Leman, however, was fighting with capabilities that no purely human opponent could match. His enhanced reflexes allowed him to avoid strikes that should have connected, while his superhuman strength made defensive blocks feel like striking stone rather than flesh. More importantly, his tactical mind was analyzing every aspect of Jorik's fighting style, identifying patterns and vulnerabilities that could be exploited. When he finally went on the offensive, the battle's momentum shifted so dramatically that spectators later claimed they witnessed magic rather than martial skill. The conclusion of the duel established several precedents that would define Leman's leadership style for the rest of his career. Rather than delivering a killing blow that would have been well within his rights, Leman disarmed and immobilized his opponent in a manner that demonstrated complete tactical superiority while preserving Jorik's honor and life. The defeated warrior, recognizing both the skill and mercy that had been shown, swore binding oaths of loyalty that transformed a potential rival into one of Leman's most trusted lieutenants. This pattern of converting opponents into allies through demonstrations of overwhelming capability became one of Leman's most distinctive leadership techniques. Over the following months, he systematically challenged and defeated every warrior within the tribe who questioned his authority, but always in ways that enhanced rather than diminished the defeated fighter's status within the group. His victories were so complete and so tactically sophisticated that opposition began to seem not just futile, but foolishly wasteful. The real test of Leman's capabilities came when external threats began to challenge the Russ tribe's territorial claims. The Grimskull clan, traditional enemies of the Russ and one of the largest tribal confederations on Fenris, had been watching the internal dynamics of their rivals with considerable interest. When reports reached their war leaders describing Then-Ger's unusual heir, they saw an opportunity to test the new leadership while the succession was still being established. The Grimskull attack came during the deepest part of winter, when traditional Fenrisian warfare doctrine suggested that major military operations should be impossible. The assault force, numbering nearly 300 warriors, approached through a blizzard so severe that normal scouts would have been unable to detect their movement. The plan relied on achieving complete surprise and overwhelming the Russ settlements before organized resistance could develop. What the Grimskull warriors encountered instead was a defensive network so sophisticated and well coordinated that their numerical advantage became meaningless. Leman had spent weeks studying the approaching weather patterns and had correctly predicted both the timing and likely approach routes of any winter assault. Rather than concentrating his forces in static defensive positions, he had deployed small groups of warriors in carefully prepared ambush sites that would channel attacking forces into predetermined killing zones. The battle that followed demonstrated tactical capabilities that exceeded anything previously seen in Fenrisian warfare. Leman coordinated the actions of multiple combat groups across several kilometers of territory, using horn signals and pre-arranged movement patterns to maintain communication despite the blizzard conditions. His ability to predict enemy movements and position his forces accordingly seemed almost supernatural to warriors accustomed to much simpler tactical approaches. More impressive than the tactical sophistication was Leman's ability to inspire his warriors to perform far beyond their normal capabilities. Fighters who had seemed competent but unremarkable under previous leadership displayed levels of coordination, courage, and tactical flexibility that transformed them into elite soldiers. The psychological effect of having absolute confidence in their leaders' strategic decisions allowed individual warriors to take risks and make split-second tactical choices that they would never have attempted under less capable command. The Grimskull defeat was so complete and so tactically one-sided that news of the battle spread throughout Fenris within weeks. Other tribal leaders began to reassess their understanding of the Russ tribe's military capabilities, while potential allies started to consider the advantages of association with such formidable leadership. More importantly, from Leman's perspective, the victory had demonstrated to his own people that the lessons learned among the wolf packs could be applied to human warfare with devastating effectiveness. Following this success, Leman began to implement organizational changes that would revolutionize Fenrisian military culture. He established formal training programs that taught coordination and pack tactics to warriors who had previously fought as individuals. He developed communication systems that allowed larger groups to coordinate their actions across greater distances. Most significantly, he began to select and train subordinate leaders who could implement his tactical concepts independently, multiplying the effectiveness of his personal leadership across larger formations. The creation of the Einherjar represented the culmination of these organizational innovations. Rather than simply selecting the strongest or most experienced warriors for his personal guard, Leman chose individuals who demonstrated the psychological flexibility necessary to adapt to his revolutionary tactical concepts. These men became not just elite fighters, but tactical specialists who could serve as extensions of their leaders' strategic thinking. Each member of the Einherjar underwent training that would have been impossible under previous Fenrisian military traditions. They learned to fight as individuals when circumstances required it, but more importantly, they mastered the complex coordination techniques that allowed small groups to achieve effects normally requiring much larger forces. They studied the terrain and weather patterns of their homeworld with scientific precision, developing understanding that allowed them to exploit environmental factors that previous generations had simply endured. The psychological transformation that accompanied this military revolution was perhaps even more significant than the tactical innovations themselves. Under Leman's leadership, the Russ tribe began to think of itself not as a collection of individual warriors bound together by kinship ties, but as a single organism whose various parts functioned in perfect coordination. This shift in perspective would prove crucial when the time came to integrate Fenrisian culture with the broader imperial military doctrine. As word of these achievements spread beyond Fenris, they began to attract attention from sources that the tribal warriors could never have imagined. Deep within the imperial palace, on distant Terra, the Emperor of Mankind was receiving reports that suggested one of his lost sons had not only survived, but was demonstrating the leadership capabilities that justified the enormous resources invested in the Primarch project. The time was approaching when Leman Russ would discover that his destiny extended far beyond the boundaries of a single death world, but that discovery would bring responsibilities and moral burdens that no amount of tactical brilliance could prepare him to bear. The arrival of the Emperor on Fenris was preceded by phenomena that even the planet's shamans found impossible to interpret through their traditional frameworks. For 3 days before the Golden Stranger set foot on Fenrisian soil, the aurora displays that normally danced across the polar skies extended to cover the entire planet in sheets of light that pulsed with colors beyond the normal spectrum. The planet's indigenous wildlife fell silent, as if some primal instinct warned them that forces beyond their comprehension were approaching their world. The Emperor did not announce his presence with fanfare or military display. Instead, he appeared at the gates of the Great Hall that Leman Russ had constructed as the seat of his growing kingdom, alone and apparently unarmed, requesting audience with the Wolf King according to the ancient protocols of Fenrisian hospitality. To the guards who challenged him, he appeared to be simply an unusually tall and imposing traveler, though none could later explain why their hands shook when they looked directly at his face. Leman himself felt the approaching presence hours before the Emperor reached his hall. The sensation was unlike anything he had experienced, a recognition that operated on levels deeper than conscious thought. When the two primarchs finally stood face to face in the Great Hall, surrounded by hundreds of witnesses, but somehow isolated in a moment that belonged only to them, the Wolf King understood immediately that his life was about to change in ways that no amount of tactical planning could have prepared him for. The formal meeting between father and son took the form of a traditional Fenrisian challenge, though one unlike any that had been witnessed before or since. Rather than combat or displays of strength, the Emperor proposed a contest of consumption that would test not just physical capacity, but strength of will and cultural understanding. The feast that followed lasted for 7 days and nights, during which both participants consumed quantities of food and drink that would have killed normal humans, while engaging in philosophical discussions that ranged across topics from military strategy to the fundamental nature of human evolution. What observers witnessed during those 7 days was a gradual recognition between two beings who had been designed to complement each other perfectly. The Emperor's vast knowledge and cosmic perspective found perfect balance in Lebanon's intuitive understanding of human nature and practical leadership experience. Conversely, Lebanon's sometimes narrow focus on immediate tactical concerns was broadened by exposure to his Gene Father's galactic vision and long-term strategic thinking. The revelation of Leman's true heritage came not as a shocking disclosure, but as the final confirmation of truths that both participants had recognized from their first moments together. The Emperor explained the Primarch project not as scientific experimentation, but as necessary preparation for humanity's survival in a galaxy filled with hostile alien civilizations and supernatural threats that made the dangers of Fenris seem trivial by comparison. Leman learned that his enhanced capabilities and leadership instincts were not accidents of birth, but carefully designed tools created for the specific purpose of guiding human civilization through its darkest trials. More challenging than accepting his genetic heritage was understanding the scope of responsibility that came with it. The 6th Legion of Space Marines, created from the Emperor's own genetic template and enhanced with techniques that made even Primarch physiology seem limited, awaited their Primarch's leadership in campaigns that would determine whether humanity survived as a species or joined the countless extinct civilizations whose ruins littered the galaxy. The decision to accept this destiny was not made quickly or lightly. Leman spent 3 days in solitude, walking the frozen wastes that had shaped his character, while contemplating the implications of leaving Fenris to serve the broader Imperium. The world that had forged him into a leader was also the source of his deepest loyalties and strongest emotional attachments. Abandoning Fenris felt like betraying everything that had made him who he was. The resolution came through understanding that his obligations to Fenris and his duties to the Imperium were not contradictory but complementary. The same protective instincts that had made him defend his adopted tribe could be applied to defending humanity as a whole. The tactical skills developed through Fenrisian warfare could be scaled up to address threats that endangered entire star systems. Most importantly, the loyalty and pack bonds that form the foundation of Fenrisian culture could become the organizational principles that held the 6th Legion together through whatever trials awaited them. The integration of Fenrisian culture with imperial military doctrine required modifications that challenged both systems. The Space Marines of the 6th Legion had been recruited primarily from Terra and had developed traditions based on the more formal, hierarchical structures favored by other legions. Introducing Fenrisian concepts of pack loyalty and honor-based leadership meant fundamentally restructuring not just command protocols, but the psychological foundations that held the Legion together. Leman approached this challenge with the same systematic thoroughness that had characterized his conquest of Fenris. Rather than simply imposing Fenrisian customs on Terran recruits, he spent months learning to understand the existing Legion culture and identifying elements that could be preserved or adapted. The process required patience and diplomatic skills that surprised many observers who had assumed the Wolf King was nothing more than a savage barbarian elevated beyond his natural capabilities. The transformation of the 6th Legion into the Space Wolves required innovations in military organization that would influence imperial doctrine for millennia to come. The traditional company structure used by other legions was replaced by great companies organized around the pack dynamics that had proven so effective on Fenris. Rather than rigid hierarchies based on rank and seniority, the Space Wolves developed leadership systems that emphasized earned respect and proven competence in actual combat situations. Each great company functioned as an extended family unit, whose members shared bonds that transcended simple military discipline. The Wolf Lords, who commanded these formations, were selected not just for tactical ability, but for their capacity to inspire the personal loyalty that made Fenrisian military culture so effective. Individual Space Marines learned to think of their squad mates not as fellow soldiers, but as pack brothers, whose survival was more important than personal glory or advancement. The integration of Fenrisian religious and cultural practices proved equally challenging and equally rewarding. Imperial doctrine generally discouraged local traditions that might conflict with the Emperor's vision of unified human civilization, but Leman successfully argued that Fenrisian customs actually supported imperial objectives rather than undermining them. The shamanic traditions became the foundation for the Space Wolves' chaplain equivalent, the Wolf Priests, who maintained both spiritual guidance and genetic purity within the Legion. The saga-telling traditions that preserved Fenrisian history were adapted to maintain legion records and celebrate the deeds of fallen brothers. Rather than the dry official documentation favored by other legions, the Space Wolves maintained their history through epic narratives that emphasized the heroic virtues and sacrificial dedication that defined their identity. These sagas served not just as entertainment, but as educational tools that transmitted tactical knowledge and moral guidance to new recruits. Perhaps most significantly, the Fenrisian concept of honor-based leadership became the foundation for the Space Wolves' approach to imperial compliance campaigns. Unlike other legions that relied primarily on superior technology and numerical advantages, the Space Wolves developed techniques that emphasized personal example and the demonstration of superior virtue. Enemy leaders were challenged to single combat, not just to eliminate opposition, but to prove that imperial civilization offered something better than whatever system was being replaced. This approach to conquest was not always popular with other imperial commanders, who often preferred the efficiency of orbital bombardment to the time-consuming process of winning hearts and minds through personal demonstration. However, the worlds brought into compliance by the Space Wolves showed remarkably low rates of rebellion and generally integrated into imperial civilization with less resistance than territories conquered through purely military means. The success of these innovations established Leman Russ as one of the most effective primarchs in terms of creating lasting imperial institutions rather than simply winning battles. His ability to blend Fenrisian tribal culture with imperial military doctrine created organizational systems that were both highly effective in combat and remarkably resilient in the face of setbacks. The Space Wolves became known throughout the growing Imperium as warriors who could be counted on not just to win victories, but to maintain their effectiveness and loyalty under the most challenging circumstances. Yet even as these foundations were being established, subtle signs were beginning to emerge that suggested the golden age of the Great Crusade might not last forever. The very qualities that made the Space Wolves so effective as shock troops and enforcers also made them poorly suited for the complex political maneuvering that was beginning to characterize relations between different primarchs and their legions. Leman's straightforward approach to leadership and his instinctive distrust of anything that seemed deceptive or overly subtle would eventually bring him into conflict with brothers whose methods differed significantly from his own. The early campaigns of the Great Crusade provided Leman Russ with his first opportunity to demonstrate that the savage reputation preceding him masked tactical capabilities that rivaled those of any primarch. The compliance of Dulan became the proving ground where the Wolf King established himself not merely as an effective commander, but as something far more dangerous to the Imperium's enemies. Here was a primarch who combined the intellectual sophistication necessary for complex strategic planning with an absolutely ruthless willingness to do whatever victory required. The Dulan system had resisted imperial contact for over 2 years, not through military strength, but through a combination of geographic advantages and political cunning that had frustrated 3 previous compliance attempts. The system's leaders had developed a defensive strategy that relied on forcing imperial forces into prolonged siege warfare while using their extensive trade networks to supply resistance movements on neighboring worlds. Previous commanders had found themselves bogged down in exactly the kind of attritional warfare that the defenders hoped would eventually exhaust imperial patience and resources. Leman approached the Doolan problem with characteristic directness, but his solution demonstrated strategic thinking that surprised even his most experienced advisors. Rather than attempting to overcome the system's defensive advantages through superior firepower, he chose to render those advantages irrelevant through a campaign that attacked the psychological and economic foundations supporting continued resistance. The Space Wolves began by systematically dismantling the trade networks that connected Doolan to its regional allies. Rather than the destructive raids that previous commanders had employed, Leman implemented a blockade strategy that preserved infrastructure while making it clear that cooperation with Imperial forces offered better prospects than continued resistance. Merchant vessels were captured rather than destroyed, their crews were treated with respect rather than brutality, and their cargoes were redistributed to populations that accepted Imperial authority. This approach achieved several objectives simultaneously. The economic pressure on Doolan increased steadily as their traditional revenue sources disappeared, while neighboring systems began to see concrete benefits from Imperial rule rather than simply threats of punishment for resistance. More subtly, the careful treatment of prisoners and captured civilians demonstrated that Imperial conquest did not necessarily mean destruction of local culture and institutions. The psychological warfare component of the campaign proved equally sophisticated. Rather than issuing ultimatums or threats, Leman arranged for detailed accounts of Space Wolves' conduct to reach Doolan through seemingly neutral sources. The stories that circulated emphasized not just the Legion's military effectiveness, but their adherence to codes of honor that protected civilians and respected local customs that did not conflict with Imperial law. When military action finally became necessary, the assault on Doolan itself lasted less than 6 hours. The Space Wolves had used their months of preparation to gather intelligence that allowed them to neutralize key defensive installations with precision strikes that minimized casualties among both Imperial forces and defending troops. The planetary government surrendered when it became clear that continued resistance would achieve nothing beyond unnecessary bloodshed. More importantly, the manner of Doolan's conquest became a template that other Imperial commanders began to study and adapt. The combination of economic pressure, psychological operations, and precisely targeted military action had achieved compliance with minimal destruction and virtually no ongoing resistance. Within 5 years, Doolan had become one of the most productive and loyal worlds in its sector, contributing both resources and recruits to continuing Imperial expansion. The success at Doolan established Leman's reputation throughout the growing Imperium, but it also began to reveal the philosophical differences that would eventually create tensions between him and several of his brother primarchs. His approach to warfare emphasized achieving decisive results with minimal waste of resources, including enemy lives, when those lives could be preserved without compromising Imperial objectives. This perspective sometimes conflicted with the more absolutist doctrines favored by primarchs who viewed any resistance to Imperial authority as deserving complete destruction. The clearest example of these emerging philosophical differences appeared during the joint campaign against the Crimson Star's rebellion. This uprising had begun on 3 worlds simultaneously and showed signs of coordination that suggested external influence, possibly from hostile alien civilizations. The strategic situation required multiple Legion involvement, bringing Leman into direct collaboration with Ferrus Manus of the Iron Hands and Mortarion of the Death Guard. The tactical discussions between these three primarchs revealed fundamentally different approaches to the problem of ensuring long-term imperial security. Mortarion advocated for the complete sterilization of all three rebellious worlds, arguing that any population that had once rebelled could not be trusted to remain loyal. Ferrus Manus proposed a middle course that would preserve industrial infrastructure while replacing the entire civilian leadership with imperial administrators backed by permanent garrison forces. Leman's alternative was characteristically direct, but strategically sophisticated. He proposed identifying and eliminating the actual leadership of the rebellion while offering amnesty to followers who could demonstrate that their participation had been coerced rather than voluntary. The approach required more complex intelligence gathering and more nuanced military operations, but it promised to preserve both the productive capacity of the rebellious worlds and the loyalty of populations that had been manipulated rather than genuinely disloyal. The debate that followed this proposal revealed tensions that extended beyond simple tactical disagreements. Mortarion questioned whether Leman's approach reflected dangerous sentimentality that might compromise imperial security. Ferrus suggested that the Wolf King's methods worked on primitive worlds like Fenris, but might be inadequate for dealing with more sophisticated forms of resistance. Both primarchs seemed to view Leman's reputation for savagery as evidence that he lacked the intellectual sophistication necessary for complex strategic planning. Leman's response to these criticisms was to request independent command of the most challenging target, the Forge world of Rust Valley, whose rebellion had been the most carefully planned and showed the strongest evidence of alien influence. His success in this campaign would either validate his approach or demonstrate its limitations under the most difficult possible circumstances. The Rust Valley operation became a masterclass in the integration of conventional military tactics with psychological warfare and intelligence operations. Rather than beginning with orbital bombardment or direct assault, Leman spent weeks infiltrating small teams of space wolves into the planetary infrastructure. These teams gathered intelligence about the rebellion's actual leadership structure, while identifying key facilities that could be captured rather than destroyed. The assault itself began not with explosions, but with the systematic disruption of communication networks that prevented rebel leaders from coordinating their response to Space Wolves' operations. Within hours, the rebellion's command structure had been decapitated through precision strikes that eliminated key figures while leaving their subordinates alive to surrender. The entire campaign was completed with casualties that numbered in the hundreds rather than the millions that previous estimates had suggested would be necessary. More significantly, the post-conquest investigation revealed that Leman's initial assessment had been correct. The rebellion had been instigated by a small group of leaders who had been compromised by alien influences, while the majority of the population had participated either under coercion or because they had been deceived about imperial intentions. The careful approach that preserved civilian lives also preserved the intelligence sources necessary to identify and eliminate the actual threat to imperial security. The success at Rust Valley established Leman as one of the most effective primarchs in terms of achieving imperial objectives with minimal resource expenditure, but it also began to create the isolation that would characterize much of his later career. Other primarchs respected his effectiveness, but questioned whether his methods reflected appropriate imperial values. The emperor clearly approved of results that advanced the Great Crusade efficiently, But Leman began to sense that some of his brothers viewed his successes as evidence of moral compromise rather than tactical superiority. This growing sense of isolation was compounded by the role that the Emperor began to assign to the Space Wolves as the Great Crusade expanded into increasingly complex political situation. The Sixth Legion became the force that other Imperial commanders called upon when standard diplomatic and military approaches had failed and more drastic measures were required. The Space Wolves developed expertise in enforcement actions that ranged from removing corrupt planetary governments to suppressing rebellions that threatened to spread beyond their worlds of origin. Each of these assignments reinforced Leman's reputation as the Emperor's executioner, but they also required him to make moral choices that his brother primarchs rarely had to confront. When dealing with human populations that had been led astray by corrupt leadership, when was mercy appropriate, and when did security require harsher measures? How could Imperial forces distinguish between genuine disloyalty and coerced compliance? What level of destruction was acceptable to prevent future rebellions? These questions would become increasingly important as the Great Crusade encountered civilizations that challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying imperial expansion. The easy victories against primitive worlds were giving way to complex campaigns against opponents who possessed technology, organization, and ideological commitment that made simple conquest impossible. The methods that had worked so effectively in the early years of expansion were beginning to reveal limitations that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. As Leman Russ established himself as one of the Imperium's most reliable commanders, he also began to understand that reliability came with costs that extended far beyond the obvious dangers of warfare. The Emperor's trust meant being asked to handle situations that other primarchs considered beneath their dignity or beyond their moral flexibility. Success in these missions enhanced his reputation for effectiveness, while simultaneously isolating him from brothers who preferred to maintain their distance from such necessary but distasteful duties. The philosophical tensions that had been simmering beneath the surface of primarch relationships began to crystallize around the question of psychic powers and their place within the imperial military structure. What started as academic debates between brothers gradually evolved into fundamental disagreements about the nature of human evolution and the dangers facing the species as it expanded across the galaxy. For Leman Russ, these discussions were never merely theoretical exercises, but urgent practical concerns that could determine whether humanity survived or joined the countless extinct civilizations whose ruins littered the stars. The growing prominence of psykers within the Great Crusade had not escaped Leman's attention, though his concerns differed significantly from those expressed by other primarchs. Where some brothers worried about the military applications of psychic abilities or their implications for traditional command structures, Leman's apprehensions were rooted in observations that others seemed determined to ignore. The correlation between psychic manifestation and unexplained catastrophes was too consistent to be coincidental. Yet attempts to discuss these patterns were often dismissed as primitive superstition. Magnus the Red had become the most vocal advocate for unrestricted psychic development within imperial forces, arguing that humanity's evolutionary destiny required the full exploration of mental abilities that had been suppressed by ignorance and fear. His scholarly approach to these phenomena impressed many of their brothers, who respected his intellectual rigor and extensive research into historical patterns of psychic manifestation. Magnus presented compelling evidence that proper training and institutional support could minimize the risks associated with psychic abilities while maximizing their potential benefits. Leman found himself increasingly isolated in his conviction that Magnus was overlooking dangers that could not be controlled through scholarship or institutional frameworks. The Fenrisian shamanic traditions had preserved warnings about forces that existed beyond the material universe, entities whose attention could be drawn by psychic activity and whose influence invariably resulted in corruption and destruction. These warnings were not based on superstition, but on careful observation of cause and effect relationships that had been documented across generations of tribal memory. The fundamental disagreement between the Wolf King and the Crimson King extended beyond simple policy preferences to encompass radically different understandings of reality itself. Magnus approached psychic phenomena as natural forces that could be studied, understood, and controlled through proper application of scientific methodology. His confidence in human intellectual capacity led him to believe that even the most dangerous aspects of psychic power could be safely managed by sufficiently trained and disciplined practitioners. Leman's perspective was shaped by a worldview that recognized limits to human understanding and control. The Fenrisian concept of forces that operated beyond human comprehension was not a confession of ignorance, but an acknowledgement that survival sometimes required accepting boundaries rather than trying to transcend them. From this perspective, Magnus's scholarly confidence appeared not as intellectual sophistication, but as dangerous arrogance that could have catastrophic consequences. The debate reached a critical point during a gathering of primarchs on the world of Nicaea, where the emperor had summoned his sons to address the growing controversy surrounding psychic powers within the legions. The council that followed became one of the most significant political events in imperial history, though its true importance would only become apparent in retrospect. What appeared to be a policy discussion about military organization was actually a fundamental choice about the direction of human evolution and the acceptable level of risk in pursuing that evolution. Magnus presented his case with the eloquence and detailed argumentation that characterized all his scholarly work. He cited historical examples of civilizations that had successfully integrated psychic abilities into their social structures, analyzed the potential military advantages that proper psychic training could provide, and outlined institutional safeguards that would minimize the risks associated with psychic development. His presentation was intellectually compelling and supported by extensive research that few of his brothers could match. Leman's counterargument was characteristically direct, but no less sophisticated in its understanding of the issues at stake. He focused not on theoretical possibilities, but on documented cases where psychic activity had resulted in disasters that exceeded any conceivable military advantage. His evidence came primarily from Fenrisian oral traditions and personal observations during compliance campaigns, sources that some of his brothers dismissed as anecdotal rather than systematic. The crucial difference between their arguments was not in the quality of evidence, but in their assessment of acceptable risk levels. Magnus was willing to accept significant dangers in pursuit of evolutionary advancement, arguing that proper precautions could reduce risks to manageable levels. Leman contended that some risks were inherently unmanageable, and that the consequences of failure were too catastrophic to justify any level of experimentation. The emperor's decision to support Leman's position, represented a victory that felt more like a burden than a triumph. The prohibition of psychic practices within the legions validated the Wolf King's concerns about the dangers involved, but it also created resentment among primarchs who felt that valuable military capabilities were being abandoned due to primitive fears. More troubling was the growing evidence that some legions were ignoring the prohibition or finding ways to circumvent its restrictions. Magnus's reaction to the Council of Nicaea revealed aspects of his character that Leman had long suspected, but hoped were not as pronounced as they appeared. Rather than accepting the emperor's judgment and working within the new restrictions, Magnus began to pursue psychic research through increasingly secretive channels. His scholarly curiosity had evolved into obsessive determination to prove his theories regardless of official policy or potential consequences. The reports that began to reach Leman through official and unofficial channels painted a disturbing picture of the Thousand Sons Legion's continued experimentation with psychic phenomena, training exercises that violated the spirit, if not the letter, of the Nicaea prohibition, research projects that pushed the boundaries of approved psychic applications, and most troublingly, evidence of contact with entities whose nature and intentions remained completely unknown. Leman's attempts to address these concerns through direct communication with Magnus proved frustratingly ineffective. His brother consistently dismissed reports of dangerous experimentation as misunderstandings or exaggerations, while maintaining that his research remained within acceptable bounds. The intellectual arrogance that had always characterized Magnus seemed to be hardening into something that approached contempt for anyone who questioned his judgment. The growing tension between the two primarchs was complicated by their fundamentally different approaches to authority and responsibility. Leman's military background and tribal upbringing had taught him that orders were given for reasons that might not be immediately apparent, but should be trusted until circumstances proved them wrong. Magnus's scholarly training had taught him to question assumptions and to pursue knowledge wherever it might lead, regardless of conventional restrictions. These philosophical differences might have remained manageable under normal circumstances, but the Great Crusade was creating pressures that made compromise increasingly difficult. The expansion of imperial territory brought contact with alien civilizations that possessed psychic abilities far beyond anything previously encountered by human forces. The military advantages that proper psychic training might provide were becoming increasingly apparent, while the risks associated with such training remained largely theoretical. Leman found himself in the uncomfortable position of arguing for restraint when every tactical instinct suggested that the Imperium needed every available advantage in its struggle against increasingly dangerous opponents. His warnings about corruption and loss of control began to seem like obstacles to necessary military adaptation rather than prudent precautions against genuine dangers. The isolation that resulted from this situation was particularly difficult for a primarch whose entire worldview was built around pack loyalty and collective decision-making. Leman had always derived strength from the certainty that his actions served purposes larger than personal ambition, but the growing disagreement with Magnus and other brothers made it increasingly difficult to maintain confidence in the wisdom of imperial policy. More troubling than the philosophical disagreements were the practical implications of Magnus's continued defiance of imperial policy. If one primarch could ignore the emperor's direct orders when they conflicted with his personal convictions, What precedent did that establish for other commanders who found imperial directives inconvenient or counterproductive? The authority structure that held the Great Crusade together depended on the assumption that all participants would subordinate personal preferences to collective objectives. Leman began to understand that his role as the emperor's executioner might eventually require him to take action against one of his own brothers. The possibility was almost unthinkable, but the logic was inescapable. If Magnus continued to pursue forbidden research, and if that research resulted in the kind of catastrophe that Fenrisian traditions warned against, someone would have to accept responsibility for stopping him. The Emperor's trust in Leman's judgment and his reputation for absolute reliability made him the most likely candidate for such an assignment. The weight of this potential responsibility was unlike anything Leman had experienced during his conquest of Fenris or his campaigns during the Great Crusade. Previous military challenges had involved clear objectives and identifiable enemies whose defeat would serve obvious imperial interests. The prospect of moving against Magnus involved destroying someone who genuinely believed he was serving humanity's best interests, someone whose only crime was excessive confidence in his own judgment and insufficient respect for limitations he considered arbitrary. As reports of psychic experimentation within the Thousand Sons Legion continued to accumulate, Leman found himself hoping that circumstances would resolve the situation without requiring direct intervention. Perhaps Magnus would recognize the dangers in his current path and voluntarily return to compliance with imperial policy. Perhaps the research would prove less promising than anticipated and would be abandoned for practical rather than policy reasons. Perhaps the Emperor would find some way to reconcile the competing demands of military necessity and acceptable risk. But even as he hoped for a peaceful resolution, Leman began the careful preparations that would be necessary if hope proved insufficient. The Space Wolves started training for scenarios that no legion had ever been asked to contemplate, developing tactics for operations against opponents who possessed capabilities identical to their own. More importantly, Leman began the psychological preparation that would be required to treat a brother as an enemy, a process that challenged every instinct and value that had shaped his character. The Rangdan Genocides marked a turning point in the Great Crusade that few outside the highest levels of imperial command truly understood. What the official records described as successful compliance actions against hostile alien civilizations was actually humanity's closest encounter with extinction since the Age of Strife. The Xenos entities that emerged from the galactic fringe possessed capabilities that challenged every assumption about imperial military superiority, forcing adaptations that would fundamentally alter the nature of space marine warfare. Leman Russ first encountered evidence of the Rangdan threat during a routine patrol mission in the Advex Mors sector, where several imperial worlds had gone silent over the course of a few months. Initial investigations suggested local rebellions or possibly primitive alien raids, the kind of challenges that individual great companies regularly handled without requiring primarch attention. What the Space Wolves discovered when they reached the affected systems was something far more disturbing than any threat they had previously encountered. The worlds themselves appeared intact from orbital surveys, showing no signs of the massive destruction that typically accompanied serious military action. Cities remained standing, infrastructure appeared functional, and atmospheric readings suggested that environmental conditions remained suitable for human habitation. However, attempts to establish communication with planetary authorities produced only silence, while detailed scans revealed no signs of human life anywhere on worlds that should have supported populations numbering in the millions. Ground investigations revealed the true scope of what had occurred. The populations had not been destroyed but transformed, converted into something that retained human appearance while serving purposes that no human mind could comprehend. These entities possessed knowledge of imperial military doctrine, spoke High Gothic with perfect fluency, and demonstrated tactical capabilities that suggested they retained access to human memories and experiences. More terrifying than their individual capabilities was their apparent coordination across multiple star systems. The conversions had occurred simultaneously on worlds separated by dozens of light years, suggesting either faster-than-light communication or some form of collective consciousness that transcended normal space-time limitations. The strategic implications were staggering because they suggested an opponent that could plan and execute operations on a galactic scale. The Space Wolves' initial attempts to deal with the converted populations using standard anti-human tactics proved catastrophically ineffective. These entities anticipated space marine assault patterns with uncanny accuracy, countered specialized weapons and equipment with techniques that suggested detailed knowledge of imperial military capabilities, and demonstrated resilience that exceeded anything documented in previous alien encounters. Worse still, prolonged exposure to these entities produced psychological effects among Space Marine forces that threatened unit cohesion and tactical effectiveness. Veterans who had remained steady during decades of combat began experiencing nightmares and hallucinations that interfered with their ability to function. The enhanced psychology that made Space Marines resistant to normal forms of mental stress seemed inadequate against whatever influence these creatures projected. Leman recognized that the Rangdan represented a threat that required resources far beyond what any single legion could provide. His requests for reinforcement were initially met with skepticism from Imperial command authorities, who found it difficult to believe that primitive aliens could pose serious challenges to Space Marine forces. The reputation that the Space Wolves had built for handling difficult assignments actually worked against them in this case, as their reports of encountering overwhelming opposition were interpreted as requests for glory rather than genuine distress calls. The breakthrough that finally convinced Imperial authorities of the threat's seriousness came when Magnus the Red independently encountered Rangdan forces during operations in an adjacent sector. Despite the growing tensions between the two primarchs over psychic policy, Magnus's scholarly reputation and detailed documentation of alien capabilities provided corroboration that could not be dismissed. More importantly, his analysis suggested that the Rangdan possessed psychic abilities that operated on principles completely different from human psyche phenomena. The multi-legion response that followed represented the largest military operation since the early years of the Great Crusade, involving not just Space Marine forces, but elements of the Imperial Army and specialized formations that had never been deployed outside the Sol system. The Emperor himself took personal command of the campaign, bringing with him technological capabilities and strategic resources that most Imperial forces had never seen. What followed was not a war in any conventional sense, but a battle for the survival of human consciousness as a distinct phenomenon in the galaxy. The Rangdan did not simply seek to conquer Imperial territory, but to incorporate human civilization into some larger collective entity whose nature and purposes remained incomprehensible. Victory required not just defeating alien military forces, but preventing the spread of influence that could convert loyal imperial citizens into extensions of hostile alien will. The campaigns that followed stretched across multiple years and claimed casualties that dwarfed losses sustained during any previous imperial military operation. Entire great companies of space wolves were lost in single engagements, their gene seed recovered only after battles that required orbital bombardment to prevent further contamination. The psychological toll on surviving forces was equally devastating, as even victory against Rangdan forces often came at the cost of exposure to influences that permanently altered the mental state of those involved. For Leman personally, the Rangdan Xenociders represented a fundamental challenge to his understanding of warfare and leadership. The tactical principles that had served him so effectively during compliance campaigns proved inadequate against opponents who could anticipate and counter space marine capabilities with supernatural accuracy. The pack loyalty that formed the foundation of Space Wolves' effectiveness was actively exploited by enemies who could turn that loyalty into a weapon against itself. The lesson that emerged from these campaigns was that the galaxy contained threats that could not be defeated through conventional military means, no matter how sophisticated or well executed. Some opponents required approaches that pushed the boundaries of acceptable imperial practice, utilizing technologies and techniques that carried risks almost as serious as the threats they were designed to counter. More troubling was the realization that these extreme threats were becoming more common rather than less frequent as imperial expansion continued. The galactic fringe contained civilizations and entities whose capabilities exceeded anything that had been encountered during the early years of the Great Crusade. Each new sector brought contact with phenomena that challenged imperial assumptions about the nature of reality and the limits of human achievement. The Emperor's response to the Rangdan threat included measures that few imperial commanders were authorized to know about, let alone implement. Technologies that had been sealed away since the Dark Age of technology were deployed under circumstances that required extreme secrecy and careful control. The moral compromises required to deploy these weapons created ethical dilemmas that affected even the primarchs charged with their implementation. Leman found himself questioning not just the tactical decisions required by the Rangdan campaigns, but the fundamental assumptions underlying the Great Crusade itself. If humanity's expansion into the galaxy inevitably brought contact with threats of this magnitude, was the conquest of additional worlds actually serving imperial interests? Could the benefits of increased territory and resources justify the risks associated with encountering increasingly dangerous alien civilizations? These questions became even more pressing as reports began to filter in about changes within the Great Crusade's command structure. Horus had been elevated to the position of War Master, assuming responsibilities that had previously been retained by the Emperor himself. While this development had been presented as a natural evolution of imperial organization, some aspects of the transition raised concerns among primarchs who were familiar with the political dynamics involved. Horus had always been one of the most charismatic and politically sophisticated of the primarchs, qualities that made him effective in negotiations with recently conquered worlds and in coordination between different legion forces. However, these same qualities also made him susceptible to influences that might compromise his judgment or his loyalty to imperial principles. The position of War Master provided access to information and resources that could be misused by someone whose motivations were not perfectly aligned with imperial interests. Leman's concerns about Horus were complicated by his own relationship with his brother, which had always been cordial but never particularly close. The Wolf King's reputation for directness and lack of political sophistication had sometimes put him at odds with Horus's more diplomatic approach to leadership challenges. While these differences had never created serious conflicts, they had prevented the development of the personal trust that might have allowed Leman to directly address his growing concerns. The combination of external threats like the Rangdan and internal changes in imperial leadership created a strategic environment that was becoming increasingly unstable. The Great Crusade was succeeding in its immediate objectives of territorial expansion and alien suppression, but the long-term costs of that success were beginning to accumulate in ways that threatened the fundamental coherence of imperial civilization. Leman began to understand that his role as the emperor's executioner might soon require him to make choices that would test his loyalty and judgment in ways that no previous assignment had demanded. The threats facing the Imperium were no longer external challenges that could be met with superior military force, but internal contradictions that struck at the heart of everything the Great Crusade was supposed to achieve. The skills that had made him effective during territorial conquest might prove inadequate for the political and moral challenges that lay ahead. The sealed orders that arrived from Terra carried the Emperor's personal seal and bore classification levels that Leman had never seen before in all his years of service to the Great Crusade. The parchment itself seemed to radiate authority that went beyond mere written commands, suggesting that these instructions carried weight that transcended normal military protocol. When Leman broke the seal and read the contents, he understood immediately that he was being asked to cross a threshold from which there could be no return. Magnus the Red and his 1,000 Sons Legion were to be brought to compliance through whatever means proved necessary. The language was carefully chosen to avoid explicit commands while making the Emperor's intentions unmistakably clear. This was not a request for negotiation or diplomatic intervention, but authorization for the most extreme sanction that could be applied to a Space Marine Legion. The Wolf King was being asked to serve as executioner, not just of enemies, but of his own brother. The justification provided in the sealed orders was both comprehensive and terrifying in its implications. Magnus had not merely continued his psychic research in defiance of the Nicaea prohibition, but had made contact with entities whose influence threatened the very foundations of imperial civilization. The breach of the psychic wards protecting the imperial palace had been just the beginning of a cascade of disasters that could ultimately result in humanity's extinction as a free-willed species. Yet even as Leman absorbed the magnitude of what was being asked of him, doubts began to surface that had nothing to do with his ability to carry out the mission. The strategic situation that had developed around the 1,000 Sons seemed almost too perfectly aligned to justify the extreme response that was being authorized. Magnus's research had certainly pushed the boundaries of acceptable practice, but the transition from policy violation to existential threat appeared to have occurred with suspicious suddenness. The presence of custodian guard and Sisters of Silence reinforcements arriving at the Space Wolves fleet suggested that this operation had been planned well in advance of the immediate crisis that had supposedly triggered it. These forces represented resources that were normally reserved for the most critical threats to imperial security, yet they had been deployed and positioned with efficiency that implied foreknowledge rather than reactive response. Leman found himself questioning not the necessity of action against Magnus, but the timing and scope of what was being demanded. The sealed orders had come through normal imperial communication channels, but recent reports suggested that those channels might have been compromised by the very forces that the mission was supposed to neutralize. If hostile entities could influence psychic communications, could they also manipulate official orders to serve their own purposes? The Wolf King's strategic instincts, honed through decades of warfare against enemies who specialized in deception and misdirection, detected patterns in the current situation that resembled tactics he had encountered during campaigns against particularly sophisticated opponents. The convergence of crises, the timing of revelations, and the apparent inevitability of violent resolution all suggested the influence of intelligence that was manipulating events rather than simply responding to them. Despite these concerns, Leman recognized that the fundamental issue remained unchanged, regardless of who or what might be influencing specific events. Magnus had indeed violated the explicit prohibition against psychic experimentation, had indeed made contact with entities whose nature and intentions remained unknown, and had indeed compromised the security measures that protected imperial leadership from psychic infiltration. Whether these actions were the result of scholarly arrogance, deliberate treachery, or manipulation by hostile forces, they had created dangers that required immediate response. The preparation for what would become known as the burning of Prospero represented the most complex operation that Leman had ever planned, combining elements of conventional military assault with specialized techniques for dealing with psychic phenomena that exceeded normal Space Marine training. The Sisters of Silence provided capabilities for neutralizing psychic defenses that would otherwise make the Thousand Suns' homeworld nearly invulnerable to attack. The Custodian Guard brought weapons and equipment that had been specifically designed for operations against other Imperial forces. More challenging than the technical aspects of the mission was the psychological preparation required to treat fellow Space Marines as enemies rather than brothers. The Thousand Suns were not alien invaders or rebellious civilians, but warriors who had served the Imperium with distinction for over 2 centuries. Many individual Thousand Suns had fought alongside Space Wolves during joint operations, had shared the dangers of compliance campaigns, and had earned personal respect through demonstrated courage and competence. Leman addressed this challenge through careful reframing of the mission's objectives and moral context. The enemy was not the individual Space Marines of the Thousand Suns Legion, but the corruption that had compromised their judgment and loyalty. The goal was not to destroy brave warriors, but to prevent the spread of influence that had already claimed Magnus and threatened to claim others. The burning of Prospero was presented as a rescue mission that would save both the Thousand Suns and the broader Imperium from dangers that exceeded immediate comprehension. The Space Wolves' approach to the assault reflected this psychological framework, emphasizing precision strikes against leadership targets, while offering opportunities for surrender to warriors whose loyalty might still be recoverable. The orbital bombardment that began the operation was carefully calibrated to neutralize military installations while preserving civilian infrastructure that could be restored once the psychic corruption had been eliminated. Yet even as these tactical considerations were being implemented, Leman maintained hope that direct confrontation might still be avoided. His final attempts to contact Magnus before the assault began were not mere formalities, but genuine efforts to find some resolution that would preserve both imperial security and the bonds of brotherhood that connected the primarchs. The possibility that Magnus might recognize the dangers in his current path and voluntarily submit to imperial judgment remained until the moment that Thousand Suns forces opened fire on approaching Space Wolves transports. The battle that followed was unlike anything that either legion had experienced during their previous campaigns. The Thousand Suns fought with desperate courage, enhanced by psychic abilities that allowed individual warriors to achieve effects normally requiring entire squads. Their knowledge of Space Wolves' tactics, gained through decades of cooperation, allowed them to anticipate and counter assault patterns with devastating effectiveness. The psychic phenomena that accompanied their resistance created battlefield conditions that challenged even veteran Space Marines' psychological stability. The Space Wolves responded with tactics that reflected both their traditional strengths and adaptations developed specifically for this mission. The pack coordination that had always characterized their fighting style proved particularly effective against opponents whose psychic abilities were disrupted by the presence of Sisters of Silence. The Fenrisian instincts that had been refined through years of hunting dangerous prey allowed them to identify and exploit weaknesses in defenses that relied too heavily on supernatural advantages. More importantly, the Space Wolves maintained focus on their mission objectives even as the battle's emotional cost began to accumulate. Each Thousand Suns position that was overrun contained evidence of the corruption that had spread throughout the Legion, validating the necessity of the action while making its execution increasingly difficult. The warriors they were fighting had not chosen corruption, but had been deceived by influences that exceeded their ability to recognize or resist. The culminating confrontation between Leman and Magnus embodied all the tragedy and complexity that had led to this moment. Two brothers who had once served the same cause with equal dedication were now forced into opposition by circumstances that neither had chosen but both had helped to create. The duel that followed was not simply a contest of physical capabilities, but a final attempt by both primarchs to justify the choices that had brought them to this point. Magnus fought not just to defend his homeworld, but to vindicate the research that had consumed his existence for decades. His conviction that psychic development represented humanity's evolutionary destiny remained unshaken, even as evidence of its dangers became undeniable. The powers he commanded during the battle demonstrated both the potential benefits and the catastrophic risks associated with unrestricted psychic experimentation. Leman fought with the grim determination of someone who understood that victory would provide no satisfaction and might not even serve the purposes it was supposed to achieve. His duty to the Emperor and his loyalty to imperial civilization demanded that he stop Magnus, but the cost of success included the destruction of relationships and institutions that had taken centuries to build. The breaking of his brother, both literally and figuratively, represented a failure of understanding and communication that extended far beyond individual responsibility. The aftermath of Prospero left Leman with a victory that felt like defeat and knowledge that created more problems than it solved. The evidence uncovered during the battle confirmed that Magnus had indeed been manipulated by hostile forces, but it also revealed that those same forces had influenced the decisions that led to the confrontation. The Space Wolves had been used as instruments in a larger strategy whose ultimate objectives remained unclear, but whose immediate effects had been to eliminate one of the Imperium's most powerful defenders. As the Space Wolves prepared to depart the burning ruins of the Thousand Suns homeworld, Leman began to understand that the mission he had just completed might have been the opening move in a conflict that would ultimately consume everything he had spent his life defending. The Vox transmission that reached the Space Wolves' fleet as they departed the ashes of Prospero carried authentication codes that identified it as an urgent priority message from War Master Horus himself. The communication contained orders for immediate redeployment to support operations in the Istvan system, where Loyalist forces were reportedly encountering unexpected resistance from rebellious elements within several Space Marine legions. What should have been routine coordination between Imperial forces had apparently escalated into a crisis that required the specialized capabilities that only the Space Wolves could provide. Leman's initial reaction to these orders was relief rather than concern. The moral weight of the actions at Prospero had left him eager for assignment to operations that involved clear distinctions between loyal Imperial forces and their enemies. The prospect of fighting alongside other legions against rebels who had abandoned their oaths offered the possibility of redemption through service that served unambiguous Imperial interests. Yet, even as the Space Wolves began preparations for transit to Istvan, disturbing reports were filtering through Imperial communication networks that suggested the situation throughout the galaxy was deteriorating far more rapidly than official channels acknowledged. Worlds that had been considered completely secure were reporting uprisings that seemed to have been coordinated across impossible distances. Space Marine forces that had served with distinction for centuries were suddenly turning their weapons against Imperial institutions they had previously defended. The pattern that emerged from these reports reminded Leman of intelligence he had gathered during campaigns against enemies who specialized in subversion and psychological warfare. The timing and coordination of these rebellions suggested external influence rather than spontaneous uprising, while the speed with which they spread indicated preparation that must have been underway for years rather than months. More troubling than the strategic implications were the personal dimensions of what was being reported. Several of his brother primarchs had apparently joined the rebellion against Imperial authority, including some who had previously been among the most reliable supporters of the Great Crusade. The possibility that Horus himself might be involved in coordinating resistance to the Emperor's authority was being discussed in coded communications that suggested knowledge too dangerous to transmit openly. The revelation came not through official channels, but through an intercepted transmission that had been intended for Thousand Suns forces that were no longer in position to receive it. The message contained detailed information about a conspiracy that reached to the highest levels of Imperial command and included primarchs whose loyalty had never previously been questioned. According to this intelligence, the rebellion was not a recent development, but represented the culmination of corruption that had been spreading through Imperial institutions for decades. Horus was not merely supporting the rebellion, but actively leading it, using his position as War Master to coordinate actions against the Emperor, while maintaining the appearance of loyal service. The orders that had sent the Space Wolves to Prospero had been manipulated to serve the rebellion's objectives, eliminating one of the most psychically powerful loyal legions at a moment when such capabilities would be desperately needed. The strategic situation that Leman faced upon learning this information was unlike anything he had encountered during his previous military career. The enemy was not an external threat that could be defeated through conventional military operations, but a conspiracy that had infiltrated imperial institutions at every level. Many of the communication channels, supply networks, and command structures that the Space Wolves normally relied upon had been compromised or could not be trusted without verification that might be impossible to obtain. Worse still, the rebellion had apparently been timed to exploit weaknesses created by recent imperial actions. The destruction of the Thousand Suns had eliminated psychic capabilities that would have been invaluable for detecting and countering the kinds of supernatural influence that seemed to be driving the conspiracy. The deployment of loyal forces to respond to manufactured crises had scattered potential resistance across the galaxy, while concentrating rebellious forces in positions where they could achieve maximum strategic impact. Leman's response to this revelation reflected both his tactical training and his psychological makeup. Rather than attempting to return to Terra immediately, which would likely result in his forces being intercepted and destroyed by superior numbers of rebel forces, he chose to implement a strategy that would maximize the damage his legion could inflict on the conspiracy while preserving their capabilities for extended operations. The Space Wolves began a campaign of harassment and sabotage that was designed to disrupt rebel operations while avoiding the kind of decisive battles that would favor their numerically superior opponents. This approach required abandoning many of the conventional military principles that had guided previous imperial campaigns, but it offered the best hope of maintaining an effective resistance until the broader strategic situation became clearer. The transformation of the Space Wolves from a conventional assault force into a guerrilla army demonstrated capabilities that surprised even Leman himself. The pack-hunting instincts that had always characterized the Legion's combat style proved remarkably well-suited for operations that required stealth, patience, and the ability to strike at vulnerable targets while avoiding stronger enemy forces. The Fenrisian traditions of tracking and persistence hunting translated directly into tactics for locating and eliminating key rebel personnel. More importantly, the Legion's culture of independence and self-reliance allowed them to maintain unit cohesion and morale despite the isolation and uncertainty that characterized their new operational environment. Space Wolves, who had been trained to think of their pack brothers as family, were psychologically prepared for extended operations without external support or clear strategic guidance. The intelligence that the Space Wolves gathered during these operations painted a picture of corruption that exceeded even the most pessimistic assessments that Leman had developed based on initial reports. The rebellion was not limited to a few disloyal primarchs, but included entire legions whose loyalty had been systematically undermined through processes that combined political manipulation with supernatural influence. The entities that had corrupted Magnus and his 1,000 sons had apparently been working to achieve similar effects among other imperial forces, but through more subtle means that avoided the kind of dramatic psychic manifestations that had made the Prospero situation so obvious. The corruption spread through appeals to ambition, resentment, and ideological differences that already existed within imperial institutions, making it difficult to distinguish between legitimate political disagreements and hostile manipulation. Perhaps most disturbing was evidence suggesting that the rebellion had been planned to exploit the Emperor's withdrawal from direct involvement in imperial governance. The mysterious project that had required the master of mankind to remain on Terra rather than leading the Great Crusade personally, had created opportunities for corruption that might not have existed if imperial leadership had maintained more direct oversight of military operations. The Space Wolves guerrilla campaign achieved tactical successes that exceeded Leman's expectations, while revealing strategic information that made the broader situation appear increasingly desperate. Rebel forces were receiving support from sources that possessed capabilities far beyond anything that normal human civilization could provide. The coordination of operations across multiple star systems suggested either communication technologies that exceeded imperial capabilities or some form of supernatural connection that transcended normal space-time limitations. The decision to attempt direct action against Horus himself represented both strategic calculation and personal necessity for Leman. The War Master's betrayal had not only endangered imperial civilization, but had specifically manipulated the Space Wolves into actions that had damaged their honor and effectiveness. The destruction of Prospero would remain a permanent stain on the Legion's reputation, unless it could be demonstrated that they had been deceived rather than willing participants in an unjustified assault. The hunt for Horus required capabilities that pushed the Space Wolves to their operational limits, while teaching them lessons about warfare that had never been covered in their previous training. Fighting against rebels who possessed detailed knowledge of imperial military doctrine and equipment required constant tactical adaptation and innovation. The supernatural influences that enhanced rebel capabilities forced the Space Wolves to develop countermeasures for threats that exceeded normal understanding of battlefield dynamics. More challenging than the technical aspects of the campaign were the psychological demands of fighting former allies who had once been brothers in arms. Many of the rebels they encountered had served alongside Space Wolves during joint operations and had earned personal respect through demonstrated courage and competence. The corruption that had turned them against imperial authority had not necessarily eliminated the admirable qualities that had made them effective imperial servants. Leman found himself constantly struggling to maintain the clear moral distinctions that had made previous military operations psychologically manageable. The rebellion was unquestionably wrong and had to be stopped regardless of cost, but the rebels were not simple enemies who could be destroyed without regret. They were victims of corruption who deserved pity as much as condemnation, fellow servants of humanity who had been deceived into betraying everything they had once valued. The hunt for Horus continued across multiple star systems and consumed months of desperate warfare that gradually wore down the Space Wolves' strength while failing to achieve their primary objective. The War Master possessed resources and capabilities that allowed him to avoid decisive confrontation while maintaining operations that inflicted steady casualties on pursuing loyalist forces. The campaign began to resemble the kind of attritional warfare that favored the side with superior numbers and supply lines. As news reached them of the siege of Terra and the final desperate battle for the imperial palace, Leman was forced to accept that his personal vendetta against Horus had prevented the Space Wolves from participating in the defense of their homeworld and their emperor. The tactical successes they had achieved during their guerrilla campaign were meaningless compared to the possibility that imperial civilization might fall while its supposed executioners were chasing shadows in the outer darkness. The final desperate transit to Terra consumed the last reserves of strength that the Space Wolves had preserved through months of guerrilla warfare across the outer systems. Their fleet, reduced to less than half its original strength through constant skirmishing with rebel forces, pushed their engines beyond safe operational parameters in a race against time that might already be lost. The Vox communications they intercepted during the journey painted a picture of siege warfare that had reduced the cradle of human civilization to a battlefield where every street and building had become a fortress. When the Space Wolves finally translated into the Sol system, the sight that greeted them exceeded even the most pessimistic expectations they had developed based on fragmentary reports. The orbital space around Terra writhed with the aftermath of naval engagements that had consumed entire fleets, while the planet's surface glowed with fires that marked the progress of urban warfare on a scale that defied comprehension. The Emperor's palace, visible even from orbital distance as a scar of destruction carved into the planet's surface, bore wounds that suggested the rebel forces had nearly achieved their ultimate objective. Leman's decision to commit his remaining forces immediately to the ground assault reflected both tactical calculation and emotional desperation. The Space Wolves possessed neither the numbers nor the equipment necessary to influence the siege's outcome through conventional military operations, but their specialized capabilities might provide advantages that could exploit weaknesses in rebel positions. More importantly, the psychological need to participate in humanity's final battle overrode strategic considerations that might have counseled patience or alternative approaches. The insertion into Terra's war zone required navigation through atmospheric conditions that challenged even Space Marine survival capabilities. The air itself had become toxic through the combination of chemical weapons, burning promethium, and psychic emanations that created effects beyond normal environmental hazards. The Space Wolves' enhanced physiology and equipment modifications developed during their guerrilla campaign provided some protection, but casualties began mounting before they reached ground level. The ground fighting that followed demonstrated both the effectiveness of Space Wolves' tactics under extreme conditions and the limitations that even primarch leadership could not overcome. The pack coordination that had served them so effectively during previous campaigns allowed them to achieve tactical objectives that would have been impossible for more conventionally organized forces. Their ability to operate independently of supply lines and central command proved invaluable in urban warfare, where communication networks had been disrupted and normal military hierarchies had collapsed. Yet the sheer scale of the destruction and the supernatural influences that permeated the battlefield created challenges that exceeded any previous Space Wolves experience. The rebels had brought weapons and entities onto Terra that transformed familiar terrain into landscapes that belonged more to nightmare than to any recognizable vision of warfare. Individual Space Marines found themselves fighting not just human opponents, but manifestations that challenged their understanding of reality itself. The breakthrough that allowed Space Wolves' forces to penetrate the inner defenses of the Imperial Palace came at a cost that would have broken the spirit of lesser warriors. Entire packs sacrificed themselves to create openings that their brothers could exploit, while veterans who had survived decades of warfare disappeared into carnage that left no trace of their passing. The gene seed that represented the Legion's future was preserved only through heroic efforts that prioritized biological continuity over individual survival. Leman himself led the final assault on the Lion's Gate spaceport, the massive fortification that controlled access to the palace's inner sanctum. The battle that followed tested every aspect of his capabilities as both warrior and leader, requiring tactical decisions that balanced immediate objectives against long-term survival of his remaining forces. The enemies they faced included not just rebellious space marines, but entities whose presence on Terra represented violations of natural law that should have been impossible. The victory at Lion's Gate opened the path toward the palace's inner chambers, but it also revealed the true scope of what was being attempted by the rebel forces. This was not merely a political rebellion aimed at replacing one form of government with another, but an existential assault on human consciousness itself. The influences that had corrupted so many loyal servants were attempting to transform Terra into something that would serve purposes entirely alien to human understanding. The news of the Emperor's final confrontation with Horus reached the Space Wolves as they fought their way through the palace's outer courtyards, where every decorative garden had become a killing field, and every artistic monument had been transformed into a defensive position. The reports were fragmentary and confused, transmitted through communication networks that had been damaged by both conventional weapons and psychic interference. But the essential facts gradually became clear. The War Master was dead, destroyed by the Emperor's own hand in a duel that had taken place aboard Horus's flagship, while Terra burned beneath them. The rebellion's leadership had been decapitated through an act of sacrifice that had cost the Emperor his own life, or at least his ability to continue active leadership of human civilization. The Master of Mankind lived, but only in the sense that his consciousness persisted within technological systems that might preserve his guidance while robbing him of direct agency. For Leman, the Emperor's victory represented both vindication and condemnation. His fears about the corruption spreading through imperial institutions had been proven correct, but his response to those fears had been manipulated to serve the very forces he had been trying to combat. The destruction of Prospero, the months spent hunting shadows while Terra burned, and the countless opportunities to prevent or minimize the rebellion's success would remain permanent stains on his conscience and his reputation. The psychological impact of this realization was compounded by the physical and emotional exhaustion that had accumulated during months of constant warfare. The Space Wolves, who had begun the campaign as one of the most effective and confident legions in Imperial service, had been reduced to a fraction of their original strength, while learning lessons about warfare and betrayal that challenged their most fundamental assumptions about loyalty and duty. The immediate aftermath of Horus's defeat brought neither celebration nor relief, but rather a grim recognition that the rebellion's end marked the beginning of challenges that might prove even more difficult than the civil war itself. The Imperium that had survived the heresy was not the same civilization that had begun the Great Crusade, but something far more desperate and militaristic that bore only superficial resemblance to the Emperor's original vision. The infrastructure that had supported imperial expansion and governance had been shattered by years of warfare that had consumed resources and personnel that could never be replaced. The trust between different imperial institutions had been broken by revelations of corruption and betrayal that made cooperation difficult even among forces that had remained loyal. Most troubling of all, the supernatural influences that had driven the rebellion remained active and dangerous, even though their immediate objectives had been frustrated. Leman found himself commanding a legion that had been transformed by experiences that exceeded anything anticipated by their original training and indoctrination. The Space Wolves who had survived the heresy possessed capabilities and knowledge that made them more effective in some ways than they had ever been, but they also carried psychological wounds that would never completely heal. The innocent confidence that had once characterized their approach to warfare had been replaced by a wariness that recognized enemies in every shadow and betrayal behind every alliance. The reorganization of imperial military forces that followed the heresy's conclusion forced difficult choices about the balance between effectiveness and security. The primarch system that had provided leadership for the Great Crusade had been thoroughly compromised by the rebellion, while the legion structure that had enabled rapid territorial expansion had proven vulnerable to exactly the kinds of corruption that the heresy had exploited. Robert Guilliman's proposals for military reform addressed these vulnerabilities through organizational changes that would reduce the risk of future large-scale rebellions while preserving the capabilities necessary for ongoing imperial defense. The Codex Astartes represented a systematic analysis of the lessons learned during the heresy and a practical framework for implementing those lessons in ways that would serve imperial interests over the long term. Yet for Leman, these reforms represented not just practical military reorganization, but an acknowledgement that the age of the primarchs was ending. The trust and authority that had allowed individuals like himself to command the loyalty of entire legions had been permanently damaged by the rebellion's success in corrupting so many supposedly reliable leaders. Future imperial military doctrine would have to assume that no individual could be trusted with the kinds of power that primarchs had once wielded without question. The Space Wolves' resistance to complete compliance with Codex requirements reflected not just organizational preferences, but psychological necessity. The pack bonds and tribal structure that had sustained the Legion through the heresy's darkest moments could not be abandoned without risking the complete dissolution of everything that made them effective. Some compromises were possible, but fundamental changes would transform the Space Wolves into something entirely different from what they had been created to become. The years that followed the heresy's end brought challenges that proved in some ways more difficult than the Civil War itself. The Great Scouring, as historians would later name the systematic campaign to eliminate remaining traitor forces, demanded a different kind of warfare than the desperate defense of Terra. Instead of protecting known positions against attacking enemies, loyal imperial forces found themselves hunting scattered remnants across a galaxy where every shadow might conceal threats, and every ally might harbor secret sympathies for the fallen Warmaster. For Leman Russ, the Scouring represented both an opportunity for redemption and a constant reminder of failures that could never be fully expiated. Each traitor stronghold that fell to Space Wolves' assault, each corrupted world cleansed by their fury, served as partial atonement for the manipulation that had led to Prospero's burning. Yet no amount of righteous violence could restore the Thousand Sons to life or undo the damage that had been inflicted on imperial unity through fratricidal conflict. The Space Wolves adapted to this new form of warfare with characteristic effectiveness, but the psychological cost of constant combat against former brothers-in-arms began to accumulate in ways that even Primarch leadership could not entirely counteract. Veterans who had maintained their sanity through the siege of Terra began to show signs of strain when confronted with the necessity of executing wounded enemies who bore the same genetic heritage as themselves. The pack bonds that had sustained the Legion through its darkest hours were being tested by moral complexities that had no clear resolution. The hunt for Magnus and his surviving 1,000 sons became a personal obsession that consumed increasing amounts of Leman's attention and resources. Reports of sorcerous activity and psychic manifestations drew Space Wolves' forces across multiple sectors in pursuit of enemies who seemed capable of remaining one step ahead of their pursuers. Each failed operation increased Leman's frustration, while providing evidence that his fallen brother had embraced forms of power that placed him beyond the reach of conventional military response. The eventual confrontation between the two primarchs, when it finally occurred, took place not on some distant battlefield, but in the ruins of a world that had once been a center of learning and culture. The planet Gangava had been transformed by Thousand Suns sorcery into a realm where the laws of physics operated according to principles that served their master's will rather than natural constants. The Space Wolves who fought there found themselves battling not just enemy warriors, but the environment itself, as reality bent and shifted to create advantages for defenders who had abandoned their humanity in pursuit of supernatural power. Leman's final duel with Magnus represented the culmination of philosophical differences that had been building between them since before the Council of Nicaea. The Wolf King fought not just to defeat an enemy, but to prove that human strength and courage remained superior to the alien powers that his brother had embraced. Magnus wielded sorceries that defied comprehension, reshaping matter and energy through will alone. Yet Leman's simple determination to protect humanity from corruption proved sufficient to overcome advantages that should have been insurmountable. The victory, when it came, provided no satisfaction. Magnus was not destroyed but banished, scattered across dimensions in a way that might preserve the possibility of eventual return while eliminating his immediate threat to imperial security. The 1,000 sons who survived fled into the Eye of Terra, carrying with them knowledge and capabilities that would continue to threaten human civilization for millennia to come. The cleansing of their corruption had been achieved, but at costs that included the effective loss of an entire legion and the permanent exile of one of the Emperor's sons. As the scouring gradually accomplished its objectives, and the immediate threat of organized traitor resistance diminished, the Imperium began the long process of reconstruction and reform that would define its character for the next 10,000 years. The optimistic vision of human expansion and enlightenment that had driven the Great Crusade was replaced by a far more defensive and authoritarian approach that prioritized security over progress and orthodoxy over innovation. Robert Guilliman's emergence as the de facto leader of this reconstruction effort brought him into inevitable conflict with primarchs whose vision of imperial organization differed from his own systematic and hierarchical approach. The Codex Astartes represented not just military doctrine, but a comprehensive framework for governing post-heresy imperial institutions in ways that would prevent future large-scale rebellions while preserving the capabilities necessary for ongoing defense. For Leman, Guilliman's reforms represented both practical necessity and personal betrayal of everything the Great Crusade had originally stood for. The individual initiative and cultural diversity that had made imperial expansion possible were being systematically eliminated in favor of standardization that might prevent corruption, but would also stifle the innovation and adaptability that human survival required. The primarchs themselves were being reduced from independent leaders to administrators within a bureaucratic system that valued compliance over excellence. The debate over legion organization became a proxy for larger questions about the future direction of human civilization. Leman argued that the heresy had demonstrated the dangers inherent in allowing too much autonomy to individual commanders, regardless of their capabilities or loyalty. The concentration of power that had made primarchs effective during the Great Crusade had also made their corruption catastrophically damaging to imperial interests. Leman's counterargument emphasized the continued necessity of maintaining capabilities that could respond to threats that exceeded the scope of standardized military doctrine. The enemies that the Imperium faced were not conventional opponents who could be defeated through superior organization and resources, but supernatural forces that required responses that pushed the boundaries of acceptable imperial practice. Rigid adherence to orthodox doctrine might prevent some forms of corruption while creating vulnerabilities that more flexible enemies could exploit. The compromise that eventually emerged allowed the Space Wolves to maintain their great company structure while nominally accepting the authority of Codex principles. This solution preserved the organizational system that had proven effective during the heresy, while acknowledging the political reality that complete resistance to reform was no longer sustainable. The Space Wolves would continue to operate according to their own traditions, but within a framework that limited their independence and subjected their actions to greater oversight. Yet, even as these political accommodations were being negotiated, Leman was beginning to experience doubts about his role in the post-heresy Imperium that went far beyond disagreements over military organization. The Emperor's internment within the Golden Throne had created a leadership vacuum that was being filled by individuals whose vision of human destiny differed significantly from what the Master of Mankind had originally intended. The Imperium was becoming something that served its own institutional interests rather than the broader goals of human advancement. More troubling than these political developments were the personal changes that Leman recognized within himself. The confidence and certainty that had once characterized his approach to leadership had been undermined by revelations of how completely he had been manipulated during the events leading to Prospero. The tactical instincts that had served him so effectively during previous campaigns now seemed inadequate for navigating the complex moral and political challenges that defined post-heresy reality. The visions that began to visit Leman during this period were unlike anything he had previously experienced, combining elements of prophecy with what appeared to be direct communication from sources whose nature remained unclear. These experiences suggested possibilities for action that extended beyond conventional military or political solutions, but they also implied responsibilities that might require abandoning everything he had built during his service to the Imperium. The gradual transfer of authority from Leman to his subordinate Wolf Lords reflected not just practical administrative necessity, but growing recognition that his destiny lay elsewhere. The Space Wolves had evolved beyond their original dependence on primarch leadership and possessed the institutional strength necessary to maintain their effectiveness under different command structures. More importantly, the challenges they would face in the coming millennia required capabilities that could not be provided by any single individual, regardless of that individual's genetic heritage or personal capabilities. The decision to undertake what would become known as the Great Hunt was not made suddenly, but evolved through a process of reflection and consultation that consumed months of careful preparation. Leman understood that departure from the Space Wolves would be permanent, or at least of indefinite duration, and that success in his intended mission was far from guaranteed. The quest he was contemplating might result in his death, his corruption, or his transformation into something that could no longer serve human interests. Yet the alternative to action was accepting a future in which the Imperium gradually decayed into something that bore no resemblance to the Emperor's original vision, while threats that exceeded conventional military response continued to multiply throughout the galaxy. The Great Hunt represented both personal redemption and practical necessity, an attempt to address problems that could not be solved through normal imperial institutions or orthodox military doctrine. The great halls of the Fang had witnessed countless feasts celebrating victory and mourning defeat, but the gathering that took place in the shadow of Leman's announcement possessed a gravity that transcended normal ceremony. Word of the Wolf King's intention to depart on what he called the Great Hunt had spread throughout the Space Wolves with the speed that only the most momentous news could achieve. Every Wolf Lord who could reach Fenris in time had come to hear their primarch's final words and to receive whatever guidance he could provide for the trials that lay ahead. Bjorn the Fell-Handed, already bearing the scars that would eventually necessitate his internment within a dreadnought sarcophagus, spoke for many when he questioned whether the Legion could maintain its effectiveness without the leadership that had guided them since their founding. The challenges they faced in the post-Heresy galaxy required not just military capability, but the kind of moral authority that only a primarch could provide. How could mere Space Marines hope to fill the void that Leman's departure would create? Leman's response revealed both the depth of his understanding of what he was asking of his sons and his confidence in their ability to exceed his expectations. The Space Wolves had already demonstrated during the darkest days of the heresy that their strength came not from dependence on any single leader, but from the bonds of brotherhood that connected every member of the Legion. The pack survived not because the Alpha was irreplaceable, but because every member understood their role in maintaining the whole. The preparations for departure required not just the selection of companions for the Great Hunt, but the establishment of institutional frameworks that could preserve Space Wolves' culture and capabilities across potentially centuries of absence. The Wolf Priests who maintained the Legion's spiritual traditions were charged with preserving not just the rituals and customs that defined their identity, but the deeper understanding of honor and duty that made those traditions meaningful. More challenging was the question of how to maintain the genetic integrity that allowed the Space Wolves to continue recruiting from Fenris while preserving the modifications that had been accumulated through generations of warfare. The gene seed that defined their biological identity carried within it not just the Emperor's original design, but adaptations that had been earned through countless battles against enemies that conventional Space Marines could not have survived. The selection of companions for the Great Hunt represented one of Leman's most difficult decisions as Primarch. The mission he intended to undertake would require capabilities that no single individual could provide, but it would also demand absolute loyalty and the willingness to sacrifice everything in pursuit of objectives that might prove impossible to achieve. The warriors he chose would be abandoning not just their legion, but their entire lives in service to a quest whose success could not be guaranteed. The 13 Space Marines, who ultimately joined their primarch in the Great Hunt, represented not just individual excellence, but the full spectrum of capabilities that the Legion had developed through centuries of warfare. Veterans of the Heresy, whose experience encompassed every form of combat that Imperial forces had encountered. specialists in forms of warfare that pushed the boundaries of conventional military doctrine, and most importantly, warriors whose loyalty had been tested under conditions that exceeded normal human endurance. Each member of the hunting party understood that they were unlikely to return to Fenris or to see their battle brothers again in this life. The Eye of Terra, their intended destination, was known to be a realm where normal concepts of time and space broke down under influences that could drive even space marines insane. Previous expeditions that had ventured into that region had either disappeared entirely or returned, so changed that they could no longer be considered fully human. Yet the same fatalism that made the mission so dangerous also provided the psychological framework necessary to undertake it. The Fenrisian concept of honorable death in service to something greater than oneself transformed what might have been seen as suicide into the highest form of military service. If the Great Hunt succeeded in its objectives, the sacrifice would be justified regardless of personal cost. If it failed, at least the attempt would have been made with full commitment and proper honor. The final feast in the Great Hall of the Fang lasted for 7 days and nights, during which every saga and tradition that defines Space Wolves' culture was recounted and celebrated. The wolf priests led ceremonies that honored not just the warriors who were departing, but the entire history of the Legion from its founding to the present moment. The stories that were told served both as entertainment and as education, preserving knowledge that might be needed by future generations who would face challenges that could not be anticipated. Leman's final address to his legion combined practical instruction with emotional farewell in a manner that reflected both his role as military commander and his position as spiritual father to warriors who had served him with unwavering loyalty. The guidance he provided was necessarily general rather than specific, since the challenges they would face in his absence could not be predicted with any precision. The most important lesson he could impart was the need to remain true to the principles that had made them effective, while adapting those principles to circumstances that might require unprecedented flexibility. The prophecy that Leman shared during his final night on Fenris would be remembered and debated by Space Wolves scholars for the next 10 millennia. Speaking in the formal cadences reserved for the most solemn occasions, he foretold a time when the galaxy would face threats that exceeded anything encountered during the heresy, when the Emperor's work would hang in the balance, and when the Wolf King's return would be necessary for humanity's survival. The details of this prophecy were deliberately cryptic, referring to signs and portents that would only become clear when the time for his return approached. The darkest night would give way to the brightest dawn, but only after trials that would test every institution and individual that claimed loyalty to the Emperor's vision. The Space Wolves would face choices that challenged their understanding of duty and honor, but they would find the strength to make the correct decisions if they remembered the lessons their primarch had taught them. The departure itself was accomplished with the kind of understated ceremony that characterized Space Wolves' culture. Rather than elaborate ritual or dramatic speeches, Leman and his chosen companions simply walked to their transport and prepared for transit to the Eye of Terra. The warriors who remained behind maintained their positions and continued their duties, but the absence of their primarch created a void that could be felt throughout the Fang, even though nothing visible had changed. The first months following Leman's departure tested the Space Wolves' ability to function without primarch leadership in ways that no amount of preparation could have anticipated. Decisions that had previously been referred to their gene father now had to be made through consultation between wolf lords whose authority was equal rather than hierarchical. The process was slower and sometimes messier than what they had been accustomed to, but it ultimately proved more resilient because it did not depend on any single individual's judgment. The broader imperial reaction to news of Leman's departure varied according to the political interests and institutional perspectives of different organizations. Some viewed his absence as an opportunity to bring the Space Wolves into closer compliance with Codex doctrine, while others worried that the loss of such an effective primarch would weaken imperial military capabilities at a time when such losses could not be afforded. More troubling were the reports that began to filter in from various sectors about increased activity among enemies that had previously shown reluctance to challenge imperial authority directly. Word of the Wolf King's departure seemed to have spread through channels that suggested either extensive spy networks or supernatural forms of communication that allowed hostile forces to coordinate their responses to changing imperial capabilities. The Space Wolves' adaptation to their new circumstances required not just organizational changes, but psychological adjustments that affected every aspect of their culture. The confidence that had come from knowing that their primarch would be available to provide guidance in extreme situations was replaced by a more mature form of self-reliance that demanded greater individual responsibility and more sophisticated collective decision-making. Yet, even as they adapted to present realities, the Space Wolves maintained their faith in Leman's eventual return and their readiness to resume their role as his instruments when that return occurred. Training continued according to standards he had established, recruitment followed patterns he had approved, and institutional development proceeded along lines that would allow seamless reintegration of Primarch leadership when circumstances made such reintegration possible. The mystery of what Leman hoped to accomplish through the Great Hunt became the subject of speculation that extended far beyond the Space Wolves themselves. Scholars throughout the Imperium debated the significance of his departure and the implications of his cryptic prophecies, while enemies no doubt made their own calculations about how to exploit the temporary absence of one of humanity's most effective defenders. What remained certain was that the Wolf King's departure marked the end of an era in imperial history and the beginning of challenges that would test every institution and individual that claimed loyalty to the Emperor's vision. The Space Wolves would face those challenges without the guidance they had relied upon for so long, but they would face them, as Leman had taught them to face everything else, with courage, honor, and absolute commitment to the pact that bound them together. The millennia that followed Leman Russ's disappearance into the Eye of Terra witnessed the gradual transformation of the Imperium, from the expanding civilization that had characterized the Great Crusade era into the fortress state that would define human existence for the next 10,000 years. The Space Wolves, maintaining their vigil on Fenris and throughout the galaxy, found themselves serving as guardians of traditions and capabilities that much of the Imperium was systematically abandoning in favor of rigid orthodoxy and institutional stability. The Fang became not just a fortress monastery, but a repository of knowledge and techniques that traced their lineage directly to the Primarch era. While other chapters gradually modified their practices to conform more closely with Codex requirements, the Space Wolves preserved approaches to warfare and organization that reflected the personal instruction they had received from their Gene Father. This preservation was not mere conservatism, but practical necessity, as the enemies they faced continued to require responses that exceeded the scope of standardized imperial doctrine. The wolf priests, who maintained the spiritual and biological integrity of the chapter, found themselves inheriting responsibilities that extended far beyond their original mandate. In addition to overseeing recruitment and training, they became the keepers of prophecies and traditions that might prove crucial to humanity's survival in ages yet to come. The cryptic words that Leman had spoken during his final nights on Fenris were memorized, analyzed, and preserved with the same care that other institutions devoted to their most sacred texts. The gene seed legacy that Leman had bequeathed to his sons proved remarkably stable despite the modifications that had been accumulated through centuries of warfare against supernatural enemies. The Canis Helix that distinguished space wolves from other space marines continued to function as intended, producing warriors whose capabilities exceeded normal Astartes standards, while maintaining the psychological characteristics that made them effective pack fighters rather than individual heroes. Yet this genetic stability came at costs that became increasingly apparent as the centuries passed. The recruitment process that had worked effectively on Fenris during the Primarch era began to show signs of stress as the world's population adapted to changing environmental conditions and social pressures. The tribal culture that had produced ideal candidates for space marine transformation was gradually evolving in ways that made it less compatible with the Legion's requirements. More troubling were the occasional manifestations of genetic instability that suggested the Canis Helix carried within it potentials that had not been fully explored or understood. Individual space marines would sometimes undergo changes that enhanced their capabilities while pushing them beyond the boundaries of what could be considered acceptably human. These transformations were rare and could usually be managed through careful monitoring and intervention, but they raised questions about the long-term viability of the chapter's genetic heritage. The tactical doctrine that Leman had established continued to prove effective against enemies that challenged conventional imperial military responses, but it also created tensions with other imperial institutions that preferred more predictable and controllable approaches to warfare. The Space Wolves' reputation for independence and unconventional methods sometimes put them at odds with commanders who valued compliance over effectiveness and orthodoxy over results. These tensions came to a head during several major campaigns where Space Wolves' tactics achieved objectives that had been considered impossible while violating protocols that other chapters considered inviolable. The success of these operations vindicated Leman's teachings about the necessity of adaptability and initiative, but it also reinforced stereotypes about space wolves as undisciplined savages who succeeded through luck rather than skill. The broader imperial reaction to continued space wolves' independence evolved from grudging tolerance to active suspicion as the Imperium became increasingly centralized and bureaucratized. Organizations that had once valued the chapter's effectiveness began to view their refusal to fully conform as evidence of potential disloyalty that might require correction through force. The fact that this suspicion was groundless did not make it any less dangerous to the chapter's continued autonomy. The search for their missing primarch became an organizing principle that gave meaning and direction to Space Wolves' operations throughout the galaxy. Every campaign was planned with consideration for how it might provide clues about Leman's fate or progress toward the objectives he had hoped to achieve. Every victory was dedicated to his memory, while every defeat was analyzed for lessons that might prevent similar failures when he returned. This ongoing quest for their gene father created a unique culture within the chapter that combined absolute loyalty to imperial institutions with persistent readiness to act independently when circumstances demanded it. The Space Wolves served the Emperor's vision as they understood it, rather than the Emperor's representatives as they currently existed, a distinction that allowed them to maintain effectiveness while creating potential conflicts with contemporary imperial authority. The prophecies that Leman had left behind became increasingly relevant as the millennia passed, and the signs he had described began to manifest throughout the galaxy. The darkening of the Golden Throne's light, the increasing frequency of psychic phenomena, the appearance of enemies that exceeded previous classifications of threat, all suggested that the time of his return was approaching, even though his physical location remained unknown. The 13th Great Company, that had followed their primarch into the Eye of Terra, became the subject of legends that grew with each retelling. Occasional sightings of space marines bearing space wolves, heraldry in regions where no imperial forces should have been able to survive, fueled speculation about their fate and their continuing mission. Whether these reports represented genuine encounters or wishful thinking remained unclear, but they provided hope that Leman's quest was continuing even in the galaxy's most dangerous regions. The technological legacy that the Primarch had established proved equally important as his tactical and organizational innovations. The chapter's artificers maintained capabilities for creating and modifying equipment that other institutions had either forgotten or deliberately abandoned. These skills allowed the Space Wolves to continue fielding weapons and armor that provided advantages against enemies that conventional Imperial technology could not effectively counter. The cultural traditions that preserved Fenrisian identity within the chapter served not just as connections to their homeworld, but as psychological anchors that prevented the kind of institutional drift that affected other organizations over extended periods. The sagas that commemorated great deeds, the rituals that marked important transitions, and the customs that governed daily life all contributed to maintaining continuity of purpose across generations of warriors who never personally knew their Primarch. Yet this cultural preservation also created challenges, as the galaxy changed around them in ways that made some traditional approaches obsolete or counterproductive. The enemies they faced in the 41st millennium possessed capabilities that exceeded anything that had existed during the Primarch era, while the resources available to Imperial forces had diminished through millennia of warfare and institutional decay. The balance between tradition and adaptation became a constant source of debate within the chapter, as younger generations of Space Marines struggled to apply ancient wisdom to contemporary challenges. The question was not whether change was necessary, but how to implement change without losing the essential characteristics that made the Space Wolves effective in ways that other chapters could not match. The relationship between the Space Wolves and other Imperial institutions continued to evolve as both sides adapted to changing circumstances and shifting power balances within the broader Imperium. Periods of cooperation alternated with episodes of tension as different organizations pursued objectives that sometimes conflicted despite sharing ultimate loyalty to the Emperor's vision. The reputation for reliability that Leman had established continued to serve his chapter well, as even critics acknowledged that Space Wolves could be counted on to accomplish missions that other forces might refuse or bungle through excessive caution. This reliability created opportunities for the chapter to influence imperial policy through demonstrated competence rather than political maneuvering. But it also meant that they were frequently assigned the most dangerous and thankless tasks that other organizations preferred to avoid. As the 41st millennium dawned with threats that exceeded anything previously encountered in human history, the Space Wolves found themselves serving not just as one chapter among many, but as guardians of capabilities and knowledge that might prove crucial to humanity's survival. The lessons that Leman had taught them, the traditions he had established, and the prophecies he had left behind, all suggested that their greatest trials lay ahead rather than behind them. 10,000 years have passed since the Wolf King vanished into the Eye of Terra, yet his absence has become a presence that shapes every decision made within the halls of the Fang. The 41st millennium finds the galaxy burning with conflicts that dwarf even the devastation of the Horus Heresy, while new threats emerge that challenge humanity's very right to exist among the stars. In this darkening age, the Space Wolves find themselves not merely guardians of their primarch's legacy, but keepers of hope that grows more precious with each passing catastrophe. The signs that Leman foretold during his final days on Fenris have begun to manifest with increasing frequency and undeniable clarity. The great rift that now tears across the galaxy like a wound in reality itself matches descriptions found in the oldest Fenrisian prophecies, speaking of a time when the barriers between worlds would fail and ancient enemies would walk openly among the stars. The return of daemon primarchs from their long exile, the awakening of technologies thought lost forever, and the emergence of threats that exceed all previous classifications suggest that the wolf time approaches with the inevitability of winter on Fenris. Within the Eye of Terror itself, phenomena have been observed that defy conventional understanding of how that realm operates. Imperial vessels unfortunate enough to be drawn into the Eye's influence report encounters with space marines bearing wolf heraldry who appear without warning, fight with impossible coordination against chaotic forces, then vanish before any meaningful contact can be established. These warriors display tactical knowledge that spans millennia while employing weapons and equipment that suggest access to forge capabilities far beyond anything that should exist within that realm of madness. The 13th Great Company, officially lost to Imperial records since their departure with Leman Russ, has become the subject of legends that grow more substantial with each reported sighting. Refugees fleeing the latest incursions from the Eye speak of wolves that hunt in the darkness between stars, of warriors who strike without warning against the servants of chaos, then disappear as completely as if they had never existed. The evidence they leave behind includes battle damage consistent with Space Marine weapons and the lingering scent of Fenrisian winter that should be impossible to detect in the immaterium. More disturbing are the reports from within Imperial territory of Space Wolves, who claim no allegiance to any current Great Company, yet bear heraldry that predates the heresy itself. These warriors appear during the most desperate battles, fight with effectiveness that exceeds even veteran Astartes' capabilities, then withdraw before they can be questioned about their origins or objectives. Imperial authorities have classified these incidents at the highest levels of secrecy, but rumors persist among frontline forces of the dead returning to fight alongside the living. The genetic legacy that Leman left within his sons has begun to manifest in ways that recall the most ancient legends of Fenrisian shapeshifters. The Wolfen phenomenon, long considered a tragic flaw within the Space Wolves' gene seed, has revealed itself to be something far more complex and potentially beneficial. These transformed warriors retain their essential humanity while gaining capabilities that allow them to survive and fight in conditions that would destroy normal space marines. Their increasing numbers suggest that the Canis Helix is responding to stimuli that may be connected to their primarch's activities within the eye. The visions that plague space wolves throughout the galaxy have become so consistent and detailed that they can no longer be dismissed as mere wishful thinking or stress-induced hallucinations. Warriors who have never met describe identical dreams of battlefields that combine familiar elements of Fenris with impossible architectures that could only exist where reality bends to the will of supernatural forces. In these visions, a figure in wolf pelts leads armies of the dead against enemies whose very presence threatens to tear apart the fabric of existence. These shared experiences have begun to affect Space Wolves' behavior in ways that suggest unconscious preparation for events that have not yet occurred. Training regimens have intensified beyond anything witnessed since the Heresy era, while recruitment rates have increased to levels that strain the chapter's ability to properly indoctrinate new initiates. The great companies have begun to recall forces from distant deployments, concentrating strength around Fenris in patterns that suggest expectation of either massive defensive operations or unprecedented offensive campaigns. The Fang itself has become a hive of activity as ancient weapons are restored to functionality and defensive systems are upgraded with technologies that had been sealed away for millennia. The chapter's artificers work with desperate intensity to prepare equipment whose purpose remains unclear, but whose importance seems to be understood on an instinctive level that transcends rational planning. Weapon stockpiles that could supply entire Imperial Guard regiments are being assembled, while void-capable transports are being modified for operations that would normally require specialized vessels. The broader Imperial reaction to these developments reflects both hope and apprehension about what changes may be approaching. The return of Robiut Guilliman has demonstrated that primarchs can indeed return from apparent death to resume active leadership. But it has also revealed how dramatically the Imperium has changed during their absence. The rigid hierarchies and conservative doctrines that have evolved over 10 millennia may prove inadequate for the kind of dynamic leadership that primarchs represent. Other Imperial institutions watch the Space Wolves' preparations with mixtures of anticipation and concern. The Adeptus Mechanicus seeks to understand the technologies being employed while worrying about their compliance with orthodox doctrine. The Ecclesiarchy debates whether the return of primarchs represents divine intervention or dangerous deviation from established religious truth. The Administratum struggles to maintain bureaucratic control over organizations that may soon operate under authority that transcends normal imperial hierarchy. Yet these institutional concerns pale beside the strategic reality that humanity faces threats requiring responses that exceed conventional capabilities. The Tyranid hive fleets that consume entire sectors represent existential challenges that demand innovation rather than adherence to established doctrine. The Necron dynasties that awaken with technologies surpassing human understanding require countermeasures that push the boundaries of what the Imperium considers acceptable. The daemon incursions that exploit the great rifts influence need responses that combine military effectiveness with spiritual purity. The mystery of what Leman Russ seeks within the Eye of Terra continues to generate theories that range from scholarly speculation to desperate hope. Some believe he pursues artifacts or knowledge that could restore the Emperor to active leadership of human civilization. Others suggest he gathers allies among forces that might serve imperial interests despite their apparent corruption by chaotic influences. The most optimistic theories propose that he prepares for a final campaign that could eliminate the supernatural threats that have plagued humanity since the galaxy's darkest age. Archaeological evidence discovered on worlds throughout the galaxy suggests that the Wolf King's influence extends far beyond anything previously understood. Ancient battlefields bear traces of weapons that match Space Wolves' patterns, but date from periods when no Imperial forces should have been present. Ruined fortifications incorporate architectural elements that combine Fenrisian design principles with defensive concepts that exceed contemporary Imperial engineering capabilities. These discoveries imply activities that span millennia and operate according to strategic plans whose scope exceeds normal human comprehension. The Space Wolves themselves have begun to exhibit changes that suggest preparation for their primarch's return operates on both conscious and unconscious levels. Individual warriors report dreams and visions that provide tactical knowledge they have never formally learned, while entire great companies demonstrate coordination capabilities that exceed their previous training. The pack bonds that have always characterized the chapter have strengthened to degrees that approach telepathic communication, allowing formations to respond to threats with supernatural effectiveness. The prophecies that Leman left behind before his departure have been re-examined in light of recent events, revealing layers of meaning that previous generations of scholars had been unable to discern. References that seemed metaphorical have proven to be literal descriptions of phenomena now manifesting throughout the galaxy. Warnings about enemies that would exceed all previous threats have been validated by the appearance of forces that challenge fundamental assumptions about warfare and survival. Most significantly, the conditions that Leman described as prerequisites for his return have begun to manifest with accelerating frequency. The darkness that would precede the dawn has settled over the galaxy like a shroud, while ancient enemies walk openly among the stars in defiance of every barrier that had previously contained them. The Emperor's light grows dim within the Golden Throne, yet signs of his intervention in galactic events suggest that the Master of Mankind prepares for conflicts that will determine humanity's ultimate fate. In the growing chaos of the 41st millennium, the Space Wolves maintain their vigil with the patience of hunters who understand that the greatest prey requires the longest stalking. They preserve traditions that connect them to their primarch while adapting to threats that exceed anything he faced during his years of active service. Their loyalty remains absolute, their readiness constant, their faith unshaken by the passage of millennia that would break lesser bonds. The Wolf King's return, when it comes, will mark not the end of humanity's trials, but the beginning of its final test. The saga that began with a child raised by wolves on a death world has become a legend that spans ages and influences events across the galaxy. In the silence between the stars, those who remember his teachings listen for the sound that will announce his emergence from the Eye of Terra, the howl that will call his sons to their greatest hunt in service to the Emperor's eternal vision for mankind's destiny among the stars.